Chapter 17 of Historical Romance of the American Negro by Charles Fowler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Continuation of the Exodus to Kansas, complete success of that grand movement, similar governments elsewhere, resolution of the Honorable D.W. Voorhees in Congress, a perfect farce in itself, the story of the Exodus, its end. We are not to suppose, my dear reader, that the coming of so many colored people to Kansas was in the beginning cordially agreed to by every white citizen of that state. Indeed, the exodus of these poor pilgrims and refugees to their consecrated soil was at first met with the most determined and violent opposition by many. But the new immigrants were usually so active, sincere, and clever in all their movements that they at once disarmed all opposition, and the white residents at once grounded the arms of their rebellion. With few exceptions, everybody was well pleased with the newcomers, and they were made thrice welcome to the soil of Kansas. Behold the hand of God in all this. St. Paul advises us to be hospitable and entertain strangers, for some have thereby entertained angels unawares. He continues to say, Indeed, I know of no better way to draw down the abundant blessings of high heaven upon our heads than by relieving really worthy and deserving people in the day of their distress. Our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ himself pronounced a splendid eulogy upon those who relieve the hungry, thirsty, and the sick and the prisoners, and he winds up his glorious sermon by saying, Inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these my disciples, ye have done it unto me. Enter ye into the joy of your Lord. If ever Christ's words were carried out to the very fullest extent, they were carried out by the welcome reception of our pilgrim host to the soil of Kansas. The Lord has a long memory for a kind act, and he has not been unmindful to shower his blessings on this flourishing state. But after all, the season of agony, doubts, and fears was but of short duration. By the year 1881, at the very latest, the regular tide of the refugees had discontinued to flow. The work of the Kansas Freedmen's Relief Association had entirely and successfully completed its work and disbanded itself as the Union soldiers did when the Civil War was over. How glorious is all this now to sit down and think of. As one door shuts, another opens. Very good indeed. Let us thank God that the world is so big and roomy, and if we have plenty of enemies here, we have plenty of friends also. It was so in the old-time Bible days, for in that blessed book we read how hosts of people and even individuals rose up and departed in millions, in thousands and hundreds, and even in single cases, and went away from among devils, that they might dwell in peace among better people. Thus history has simply repeated itself over and over again, and the exodus of colored people from the South is perhaps the most recent example of that oft-repeated affair, and it is safe to say, when we consider the natural badness of the human race, that other exoduses elsewhere will follow. It may not be in this country, but it will be somewhere. There is an old but true saying that none are so blind as those who don't want to see, which leads me on to say that the Honorable D.W. Voorhees, United States Senator from Indiana, must either have been most dreadfully blind to the truth, or else he must have been in a very childish humor when he introduced his famous resolution into the Senate at Washington for the investigation of the causes of the migration of the colored people from the southern to the northern states. Now, since this world began, dear reader, when did any one of us ever hear of such a farce as this, to institute a national inquiry of the causes of the exodus of entire legions of men, women, and children, when Mr. Voorhees and the whole population of the United States knew all about things before he ever asked the question? That inquiry cost the government thousands of dollars, flung away upon what every man, woman, and child knew already. Verily, this was the greatest national farce ever heard of from the creation of the world down to the present time of writing. While this inquiry was going on, money and clothing were sent to the state of Kansas by every train, and the refugees were rapidly scattered all over the different counties as fast as the Relief Association could secure homes for them. The Chicago Inter-Ocean newspaper sent a special correspondent to Topeka to report on the state of things in Kansas in connection with the pilgrims from the sunny South. This faithful man made the following report, which is so very interesting that I will copy it in full. Topeka, Kansas, April 9th. During the last few days, I have, in obedience to your request, been taking notice of the exodus as it may be studied here at the headquarters for relief among the refugees in Kansas. This is the third visit your correspondent has made to the promised land of the dusky hosts, who, fleeing from persecution and wrongs, have swarmed within its borders to the number of 25,000. In a letter written here in December last, the number then within the state was estimated about 15,000, and since that date at least 12,000 more have come. In the barracks today I found what seemed to be the same 100 who crowded about the stove that cold December day. But they were not the same, of course, but their places have been filled many times since with other hundreds who have found their first welcome to Kansas in the rest, food, and warmth which the charity of the North has provided here. So efficient have the plan of relief and the machinery of distribution been made that of the thousands who have passed through here, none have remained as a burden of expense to the association more than 4 or 5 days before places were found where their own labor could furnish them support. If that pure statesman of Indiana, Mr. Voorhees, whose great heart was so filled with solicitude for the welfare of his colored brethren that he asked Congress to appropriate thousands of dollars to ascertain why they moved from one state to another, will come here, he will be rewarded with such a flood of light on the question as could never penetrate the recesses of his committee room in Washington. He need hardly propound an enquiry. He had indeed best not let his great presence be known, for in the presence of democracy the Negro has learned to keep silence. But in the search of the truth, let him go to the file of over 3,000 letters in the governor's office from Negroes in the South, and read in them the homely but truthful tales of suffering, oppression, and wrongs. Let him note how real is their complaint, but how modest the boon they ask. For in different words, sometimes in quaint and often in awkward phrases, the questions are always the same. Can we be free? Can we have work? And can we have our rights in Kansas? Let him go next to the barracks and watch the tired, ragged, hungry, scared-looking Negroes as they come by the dozens on every train. If he is not prompted by shame, then from caution necessary to the success of his errand, let him here conceal the fact that he is a Democrat. For these half-famished and terrified Negroes have been fleeing from Democrats in the South, and in their ignorance they may not be able to comprehend the nice distinction between a Northern and a Southern Democrat. If he will be content simply to listen as they talk among themselves, he will soon learn much that the laborious cross-examination of witnesses has failed to teach him. He may take note of the fact that, fleeing from robbery, oppression, and murder, they come only with the plea for work and justice while they work. He may see reason to criticize what has generally been deemed by Southern Democrats at least unreasonable folly in a Negro which prompts husband and wife to go only where they can go together. But he will find nothing to cause him to doubt the sincerity and good faith with which the Negro grapples with the problem of his new life here. If he would learn more of this strength of resolution and the patience which they have brought to search for a home in a free land, let him inquire concerning the lives of those refugees in Kansas. It may seem of significance and worthy of approving note to him that as laborers they have been faithful and industrious, that in no single case have they come back asking aid of the Relief Association, nor become burdens in any way upon corporate or public charities. That as citizens they are sober and law-abiding to such a degree that he would hardly be able to discover a single case of crime among them. And finally, that in those instances where they were able to purchase a little land and stock, they have made as good progress towards the acquirement of homes and property as have the average poor white immigrant to the state. He will first learn, then, from the refugees themselves something of the desperate nature of the causes that drove them from the South, and secondly, from their lives here, with what thrift, patience, and determination they have met the difficulties which they have encountered in their efforts to gain a foothold, and as men among men in the land of equal rights. From the Honorable William Reynolds, President of the Auxiliary Relief Association at Parsons, I learned that the Negroes who have come into the southern part of the state, mostly from Texas, are all either settled on small tracts of land or employed as laborers at from $8 to $10 per month, and are all doing well. Mr. Reynolds' testimony to this effect was positive and unqualified. To assist these refugees in southern Kansas, over 3,000 in all, only $575 has been expended. From Judge R. W. Dawson, who was the secretary of the association under the old management and during the early months of the movement 1 year ago, when 6,000 refugees were distributed throughout the state and provided with homes at a cost of $5,000, I learned much of interest concerning the welfare and progress of this advance guard of the great exodus. Judge Dawson, although not now connected with the relief work, feels, of course, a great interest in the welfare of those to whose assistance he contributed much, and loses no opportunity for observation of their condition while traveling over the state. He says he knows of no case where one has come back to the association for aid, that as laborers and citizens their conduct has been such as to win the approval of all classes. 4 colonies have been established. State lands were bought by the association and given to the colonies with the understanding that to secure their title they must make the second and third payments on the land purchased on the 1/3 cash and 2/3 time payment plan. 2 of the newest of these colonies are still receiving aid from the association, but the others are self-sustaining and will be able, it is thought, to make small purchase payments on the land as they become due. If our inquiring statesman is interested in observing in what spirit these refugees receive the aid which has made existence possible during the cold weather months, he may be profited by spending a few days about the city of Topeka. There are in Topeka alone over 3,000 refugees, and nearly all of them, paupers when they come, have found means in some way to make a living. In many cases it is a precarious subsistence that is gained, and in not a few cases among late arrivals he would find evidence of want and destitution, but compared with this he cannot but be struck with the small number of applicants to the Relief Association for aid. Only 213 rations were issued outside the barracks last week to the 3,000 refugees who came here only a few months since without money, and frequently without clothing, to undertake what seemed under the circumstances the desperate purpose of making a living. The dangers and difficulties which beset the refugee's departure from a land where even the right to emigrate is denied him are great. He may learn, that is, Mr. Voorhees, however, from copies of letters over 1,000 in the governor's office, that Governor St. John has never, in reply to their appeals, failed to warn them of the difficulties that would beset their way here, and has never extended them promise of other assistance than that implied in the equal rights which are guaranteed to every citizen of Kansas. Further than this, however surprising it may be to Mr. Voorhees, his theory of causes of the exodus, it is nevertheless a fact that this very association, which is charged with encouraging the exodus, has sent the Reverend W.O. Lynch, a colored man, to the South to warn the colored people that they must not come here expecting to be fed or to find homes ready, and to do all in his power to dissuade them from coming at all. Still they come, and why they come the country and determined long in advance of Mr. Voorhees's report. While we have Mr. Voorhees here, we would like to have him glance at a state document to be found upon Governor St. John's table, which bears the great seal and signature of Governor O. M. Roberts of the state of Texas. It is a requisition by the governor of Texas upon the governor of Kansas for the body of one Peter Womack, a colored man who was indicted by the grand jury of Grimes County at the last November term for the felony of fraudulently disposing of 10 bushels of corn. From further particulars we learned that this Peter Womack gave a mortgage early in the spring of 1879 upon his crop just planted to cover a debt of $20 due the firm of Wilson and Howell. When Womack came to gather his crop, he yields to the importunities of another white creditor 10 bushels of corn to be applied upon the debt. About this time, this Peter Womack becomes influential in inducing a number of his colored neighbors in Grimes County to emigrate to Kansas. Undeterred by threats, and despite the bulldozing methods employed to cause him to remain a citizen of Texas, Womack, with others sick of a condition of citizenship which is nothing less than hopeless peonage, leaves stock and crop behind to seek a home in Kansas. His acts inciting the movement of those black serfs are not forgotten, however, by the white chivalry of Grimes County. The evidence of this surrender on a debt of 10 bushels of corn, mortgaged for another debt, is hunted up, presented to the grand jury of Grimes County. He is promptly indicted for a felony, and the great state of Texas rises in her majesty and demands a surrender of his body. The demand is in accordance with law, undoubtedly, Texas law, but if Texas would occasionally punish one of the white murderers who do not think it necessary to leave her borders, this pursuit of a Negro for selling 10 bushels of corn from a mortgage crop would seem a more imposing exhibition of the power of the Commonwealth to enforce its laws. The above extracts from the Chicago Inter-Ocean of the 15th of April, 1880, were clearly written by a humane and Christian gentleman whose sole aim was to tell the truth. Will my kind reader now permit me to sum up in a few sentences the result of this wonderful exodus? The departure of so many thousands of colored people from the different states of the sunny South to Kansas and many other northern states informed the whole world that the South was nothing but a land of thugs and common cutthroats and murderers. The exodus informed the world that Secessia was no place for them to emigrate into, where even life and limb were unsafe. It represented the Southerners as a vindictive, barbarous, and most uncivilized people, as a people, in short, who were unfitted to carry on the laws of their states in a civilized nation. It repelled the Christian world from them instead of drawing them to them in love and friendship. The exodus, in short, gave the South a black eye, to use a familiar expression common among pugilists, and afforded most abundant proof that the war had been a just and righteous one, as waged against so wicked and demoralized a race of men unfitted for civil government. Even the laughable farce of Mr. Voorhees's congressional inquiry into the causes of the exodus informed the whole world of the murderous state of mind of the Southern white people, who were unable to contemplate the sight of a colored man voting the Republican ticket of freedom without the wish of taking his life, the life of his neighbor citizen, who had even a better right to vote than himself, for the colored man had certainly never been a traitor to his country, as these selfsame murderous Southerners had been. We are all perfectly well aware that colored men could get on better without the white man than the white man could without him. The climate of the South, and especially of the far South, is warm, and men of African descent are naturally better able to stand against the rays of the hot sun than the Caucasian race. It was for this express reason that the slave trade and slavery were so long carried on with such vigor and persistency, because the African was well qualified to work among the cane brakes, the cotton fields, and the rice swamps of the Southern states. The African was found to be strong-bodied, and through and by means of his diligent labor the cities and lands of the South had been built up and tilled respectively. The poor white trash, as Caucasian laborers were termed, were not so well qualified to toil under a semi-tropical sky and extract the wealth from the soil in the same degree. No part of the United States was so rich when the war began as these states. They had amassed an immense hoard of silver and of gold by means of the labors of the slaves, although all that previous metal was thrown away upon cannon and gunpowder and all other necessaries of war, and the cause for which they fought was lost after all. Still, the fact remains that the South had to a great extent been built up by the labor of the hardy and diligent African, who was so very useful and valuable that Secessia struggled on for 4 long years to retain the colored race in slavery, and even to make slavery itself the chief cornerstone of the Southern Confederacy. But crime could not be allowed to go unpunished, and the oppressed African was entitled to his liberty and his rights. With the tramp, tramp, tramp of so many refugees from the Southern states upon their pilgrim way to Kansas and other northern states, the leading white men of the country that they left behind at last began to open their eyes to the mischief which they and their minions had already done, and they saw that they had lost the confidence of the colored race. As from 40 to 60,000 men, women, and children had gone to Kansas alone, and immense numbers had emigrated to other northern states, both far and near, the leading men in the deserted sections now began to wonder to what extent this thing would grow. They saw that if things went on at this rate, the southern states would become depopulated, or at least as destitute of inhabitants as they were upon the landing of Columbus. Something must be done to stop at once this great rush of wronged and oppressed men for other states where they could live in safety and freedom. And not only must the shotgun policy of the Southerners be brought to an end, but that system of cheating and robbery also, whereby white men had beat the colored ones out of their full share of the crops on the plantations and defrauded them in every way under the so-called credit system. It was most unmanly, cowardly, and even shameful to the last degree for wise and intelligent white men to thus rob and plunder the oppressed and uneducated African. Such a devilish policy was simply adding insult to injury. Never was a more savage thing done through the wickedness of the human race since the creation. It now became the policy of all thinking ex-rebels to put on their thinking caps and study a better system than such sheer dishonesty. The leading white men of the South therefore now went to work to reverse the system that had driven so many of the colored people out of the land, and to do every possible thing to regain their confidence, because there was no one who could fill the empty places and do the needful work. And not only was it now necessary to gain the confidence of the colored man, but even to regain the confidence of white men who had any intention of going south and settling down in that part of the country. There were many men of capital, besides thousands of accomplished artisans, who could both enrich themselves and the southern states by going and settling down there, but who were now justly alarmed when they saw whole hosts of orderly and industrious people of color moving away from these selfsame states on account of robbers and murders by the very same men among whom they had been planning to go and settle down to labor and toil, and there to end their days. It was perfectly clear to the most obtuse Southern mind that no Northern man would ever go South and invest his capital where those who ran his mills and cultivated his plantations were liable to be brought down by the shotgun of the old soldiers of Lee and Jackson because they voted the Republican ticket, if they even dared to go to the polls at all on Election Day. This was as bad or worse than despotic Russia or Turkey, and therefore Southern men wisely decided to reverse the policy they had adopted towards the colored population, for they now saw that if they did not do so, no capitalists or artisans would ever come South, but remain at home or go elsewhere. On the other hand, exodus was a benefit to the colored race, at least to a portion of them. Those who emigrated from the southern states found an abundant entrance and a warm welcome to the fertile lands of Kansas and other northern cities and western states, where there was plenty of land calling for nothing so much as cultivation, and where the oppressed pilgrims and refugees built up for themselves comfortable homes, and they and their children are there to this day. In Kansas and the other states whither they emigrated, the spirit of freedom and justice prevailed, and every man could abide under his own vine and fig tree without having any midnight thugs about to make him afraid. And those who remained behind were also benefited by the exodus, because there was now more room for those who were left there, and inasmuch as the white leaders of the South had decided upon possessing a wiser and more Christian policy, the prospect of good treatment in every respect was far brighter than ever. They need not emigrate to the North and West, as their brethren had done, but could remain at home in safety. Thus, my dear reader, I have related to you the story of the exodus of our people to Kansas and other states as it passed before our eyes about the years 1879 and 1880, as I very well remember. It was a wonderful object lesson set before the whole nation, and an outgrowth of slavery and the war and the violent passions of the vanquished. But good has come out of evil. The poor, oppressed pilgrim refugees were not forsaken in the days of their distress, for they were tenderly cared for by the most loving of mankind, and underneath them were the everlasting arms of the merciful God. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Historical Romance of the American Negro by Charles Fowler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My daughter's weddings, departure for England for the honeymoon, the voyage Letter to the Reverend Mr. Carroll, the city of Liverpool, England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland. Return home to America. Benefits of travel. This chapter will introduce the kind reader to my life and times in the eventful year 1876, eventful in the history of my own family, because my two dear daughters had now almost reached their 20th year, were therefore come to the age when the fair sex turn their hearts to the thoughts of love, courtship, and marriage. And in short, my dear children were engaged to be married in the month of May, in the spring of the year 1876. The bridegrooms were both Christian, industrious, and highly respectable young men, and such as we knew would promote the happiness of the two dear girls as well as their own. All four candidates for matrimony were well matched in every way, having been brought up in schools and colleges where the most select members of the Anglo-Saxon race themselves have received their polish. Indeed, freedom and all the advantages that flow from a brilliant education have polished our young men and maidens until now they are as smooth as a mirror, and you can see your face in that mirror as well as the best looking-glass. Thus these young people had been trained and polished till training and polishing could not be carried much further. Because they had had all the advantages that money and talent could give, they shone in the best society, and no company of refined young Christian people was considered perfect unless they were invited, enhancing the happiness of all by their presence. But the best thing of all was the pure, unadulterated Christianity that grew and flourished like the green bay tree in every heart. My own dear husband and I were most profoundly thankful to see our dear children so well inclined by grace and training to every good thought and deed, and no less so to see in their prospective husbands men who could encourage such dispositions instead of being obstacles in their way like so many others. The main points being secured, we gave our willing consent to the marriage, and it was thought best to have them both together. Accordingly, the double wedding came off the first Wednesday night of the merry month of May, and the A.M.E. church on Vine Street was packed to its utmost capacity. All the particulars of dress, bonnets, bouquets, etc., with all the latest improvements down to the eventful year 1876, were duly noted by the reporter who was present and who wrote a flourishing account of the weddings, which came out in the paper next morning. After the ceremony at the church was over, we all adjourned to our own house, where a reception was held and continued until a late hour. As my two dear girls, as I always call them, stood before the altar, I could not but reflect what their fate might have been had it not been for the providence of God, and for the fact that their parents managed to get away from slavery and gave them a good Christian education in a free state of the North. Verily, the present generation of colored men and maidens have something to be thankful for to that good Lord who sent the war, destroyed slavery, and opened the doors for them to enter in and enjoy all the privileges that the white race possesses. It is quite unnecessary for me to say that marriage is one of the greatest events in human life, and that their marriage gave each one of these four young people the most abundant joy. To still further enhance the happiness of the young people, it was decided that they should spend their honeymoon upon the ocean, and in the British Isles, where some of our ancestors had come from. And my husband and myself decided to go with them for company, and have a good time generally. So all preparations were made for our departure to pay this delightful visit to John Bull and his island, which made all feel as gay as birds. Thursday morning came on apace, the day after their marriage, and we were all in a great bustle and high excitement over our departure for Old England, as it is called. Our trunks were packed and all things made ready for the journey and voyage before us. We understood that dear mother and her devoted husband, Mr. Sutherland, were not going with us. At least they had said nothing about doing so to the rest of us. I dare say they intended to take us by surprise. And it was a surprise indeed, because when we were almost ready to walk down the street to the railway station, who came in smiling all over but Mr. and Mrs. Sutherland? We were so much surprised that we all set up a loud shout of joy, and the more especially as they seemed to enjoy the fun as much as any of us. It was a lively time that followed the next 10 minutes, and we held quite a jubilee on the subject. The minister of the church and his good lady had come up to see us off, and a few other friends of the inner circle of our acquaintances, and all things being now ready, we walked down the street to the railway station, where we found all bustle and confusion. But at last we secured our tickets, took a tender leave of our dear friends on the platform, and having taken our seats, we steamed away for New York, where we were to take the boat for Liverpool, England. We shed no tears on this occasion, because we all had to come back again in a few months. There was nothing but delightful novelty and unexpected joy before us, and therefore there was nothing for any of us to cry about upon the present occasion. The following letter, which I wrote after our landing at Liverpool, will explain itself to the reader. Liverpool, England, May 1876. Reverend Mr. and Mrs. Carroll. My dear friends, I am quite delighted to inform you that we have crossed the broad Atlantic in perfect safety, and yesterday we landed at the great seaport of Liverpool, where nothing seems to be talked about but shipping and ships. We are all in splendid health and gay spirits, and it is quite a pleasing change for us to be in a land where color is unknown. We all send our best love to you both, to all your family, and to our dear church on Vine Street, where we hope to find ourselves again in a few months among the dear brothers and sisters there. We had quite a pleasant journey on the train all the way to New York, where we arrived on the scheduled time, and found our way to the private hotel, where all things were in readiness for our reception. We spent a portion of 2 days in walking about and enjoying the sights of the city, but the time rapidly rolled around for our embarkation, and we went on board the Sarmatian, which is truly a splendid liner, indeed one of the finest boats on the North Atlantic. The Sarmatian is a British vessel, and strange as it may appear so soon, the feeling was so sweet and homelike upon this foreign ship that I could not but notice it. Officers and sailors who have been reared in a land where prejudice is unknown are in no way interested about such paltry things as the color of the skin. Seated upon this noble British ship, I felt even now as if I were already in England. Indeed, we would all have quite forgotten that there was any such thing as prejudice in any part of the world had we not been reminded of it on board by the presence of a few Americans. But even they on board a British ship were obliged to keep their personal feelings well covered up. And here I may say, when we are abroad and traveling the wide, wide world, you meet with nobody who objects to the color of your skin, but somebody from some port of the United States. But even American prejudice must die out, for all wickedness is subject to change, and God himself alone changeth never. In glorious May weather, and in the presence of a tremendous concourse of people who come down to the water's edge to see us off, we backed out into the North River at New York. The immense mixed multitude standing on the pier had sent up one tremendous cheer after another, waved their hats and handkerchiefs, and gave us a general grand hurrahing time. We replied in like manner, as we came slowly away, at first accompanied by 2 or 3 tugboats that ventured out some distance to grace our departure. No doubt the passengers on board of them had friends and relatives on the Sarmatian. We settled down at once and made ourselves at home in good earnest. We were quite at home in our sweet, cozy little cabins, and the officers and attendants were all that could be desired. We walked about the deck, sat down to read or talk, and became acquainted with some of the most delightful people on the face of the earth, most of them on errands of pleasure, like ourselves. All were in high spirits and anxious to visit different parts of Europe, the British Isles, Germany, etc. We carried on much the same at sea as we do home on shore. I spent most of my own time in conversation with our own party and other passengers, with reading new books, and with watching the play of the wild waves of the deep. Some slept a great deal of the voyage away, and others were busy courting, and that continually. I am informed that an immense number of marriages result from crossing the ocean every year. They get acquainted on shipboard and marry after they come to land. The very seamen seem to be smitten by Cupid with a great love for the fair sex, Jack Tar finds many a fair sweetheart on shipboard. Here at Liverpool you can soon see 10,000 of them walking about. A stranger in this mighty modern Tyre would be led to fancy that there was nothing in the world but sailors, ships, and shipping. And do need wonder at it in the first port of the whole world, with that great landing stage at the entrance to the Mersey, upwards of 20 miles of dock along the right bank of the river, and 10,000 masts, 10,000 hailing from every continent and all the islands of the ocean. When you come to sea, blessed with splendid health and strength and vigorous life, with high beating hope and all things before your imagination of the 7 colors of the rainbow, when all hearts are light, all eyes are bright, and nature's face is gay, then indeed you're going to have a first-class time upon the rolling deep in the merry month of May. Life on the ocean wave has really 10 times more charms than I am able to define. You must come to see yourself to experience it, for it is indeed far too much for my pen. The sea, the broad blue sea, what a glorious thing it is to look away as far as ever the eye can reach, and behold nothing but the big blue waves of the North Atlantic heaving up and down, while our bold and plucky steamboat rushes fearlessly over those watery hills, and the bright and beautiful sun pours his warm rays down upon the rolling deep, and a fascinating and bewitching feeling floods upon your own heart, and there begets a feeling of enthusiasm that no language can describe. The porpoise is a lively fish, often seen from the deck of an Atlantic steamboat, and we saw plenty of them rushing through the waves like winged lightning. It was indeed a fine sight, but the best companions we had all the way to the British Isles were the bold, brave seagulls that left the coast of America with us and came all the way to Liverpool. The seagull acts more like a human being than anything else to which I can describe him, cavorting about all over the main, and then coming down almost to the deck itself to let you know that he is there, and trying to make you feel at home on the ocean. There seemed to be no end of sweet, peaceful enjoyment. The weather continued so fine all the way across the sea. Our health was so good, and we had such pleasant companions on all sides around, and nothing happened to the ship to mar the general joy. It was indeed a downright holiday, most thoroughly enjoyed by us all. The Sabbath day came around, and there were 2 church services in the grand saloon. We all went both times, which proved, as I thought at the time, the greatest treat in our whole life. The singing, the prayers, the sermons, and everything else combined to form a novelty that I am again quite at a loss to explain. And yet there were many on board who never went to a church service at sea, although it was the very joy of our lives, and a treat that turned our gallant ship into a floating heaven on the deep. It was just the same on shore. There are people who live next door to the church who never enter its portals once in their lives. We spent a good deal of time watching for vessels on the ocean, and saw plenty of them. We passed quite close to several and spoke to a few. Some of them came so near that we saw everything on deck, and that was something when far from home. What a glorious sight it was to behold the red sun rising out of the waves in the east every morning, like a great big round red cheese, and again to watch him at night going down in all his glory in the west, like a red and fiery wheel, flooding all the main with the splendor of his glory as he sank down into his water bed. We used to stand on the open deck and watch the glorious god of day sinking, till at last he quite disappeared from view. Then the fair-faced silver moon, fair Luna, queen of night, arose in the east, and flooded all the ocean with her silver shining, that was laid so entrancingly upon the rolling waves, whilst the 1,000 stars came out in ones and twos and hundreds, and bestudded all the skies. Thus again we would gather out upon the deck at night, and watch the starry heavens and the moon, and listen to the wild waves of the North Atlantic rolling away far and near, and when night came on we found ourselves pretty well worn out after another long and busy day. But we slept well, as indeed we well might, for the good Lord and the sailors were ever taking good care of us all, and the brave Sarmatian was battling her rapid way across the North Atlantic. As I used to stand and muse upon the deck, it often occurred to my mind how all the ancestors of the colored race in America had been born over the waves of the self-same North Atlantic over which we were now sailing, though farther to the south. Over these waves also the great Frederick Douglass had passed several times on his journeys to and from the British Isles, for he is one of the great pillars of history, and has filled the whole world with his fame. His renown is bright all over the earth. Thus time passed on day and night, and we all enjoyed ourselves to the top of our bent, at the grand piano in the saloon, watching the play of the wild waves of the rolling deep, etc., etc. The excitement in every bosom began to rise as we drew near to the land, and when the old head of Kinsale rose from the main in the southwest of Ireland, there was truly a most tremendous flurry in every heart. And as the Sarmatian passed rapidly along, one lofty frowning headland after another rose from the waves, reminding one of grand lofty church steeples placed at intervals here and there. Then the bold precipitous coasts ran far away back into some estuary or frith, at the head of which a river came pouring down from the interior of the land. A heavy summer shower of rain came up all of a sudden, after which the sun burst out with indescribable splendor, and a mighty rainbow stood over the entire convex of heaven, with its great feet like elephants' legs deep down in the ocean. Our American seagulls came bravely on, and in Irish waters were met by Irish seagulls and countless wild sea mews. The excitement that began when we passed the old head at Kinsale did not subside. It went on, grew, and increased hour after hour, as we called at Queenstown, and then moved on to Liverpool. Nothing was now thought of nor talked about but John Bull and his island, Britannia, the pride of the ocean, the home of the brave and the free. We noticed that we were no longer upon the big blue waves of the North Atlantic, but ploughing our rapid way across the shallower green seas of the British Isles, quite a pleasant change in its way after so much blue, because nature's green is a beautiful color. It was time for us to go to bed as we approached St. George's Channel, that divides Ireland from Wales, but we were all up and fresh and bright as buttons in the morning, when Holyhead, the isle of the Anglesea, and the bold mountains of North Wales arose almost perpendicular out of the Irish Sea, and dipped their feet deep, deep into the waves. The excitement on board now among us all was simply dreadful. We were so near home, and yet not quite there. Hundreds of ships in all directions were moving about over all the sea, and no wonder, because we were close to the doors of one of the most famous queen seaports that this world has ever seen. At last we came up to the front of the city of Liverpool, and having a tremendous traffic in full view, and here we had to lie till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the tide would be full, and we could cross the bar of the Mersey. We crossed the bar in due time, and got into that famous river, came up to the great landing stage, where we landed in great excitement, for here at last was John Bull and his island. Having landed and passed the custom-house officers, we procured cabs and drove to our appointed quarters in the city, where we received a most hearty welcome upon our arrival, and were ushered into our rooms, and we never felt more thoroughly at home in our lives. The good people seemed determined to make us feel all right, and to make a good impression on the Americans. The English tea-time, 5 p.m., drew nigh, and we had toast and tea with jams, etc., in the regular English fashion. It was delightful to have all things so nice in a foreign way. The fire was also delightful in the open grate, and that also looked most cheerful. Pictures of Queen Victoria and the royal family hung from the walls, and battle scenes by land and sea, and landscape pictures powerfully reminded us that we were now under the British flag and in another part of the world. After tea we walked out to view the city, the river, the mighty traffic of this modern Tyre, and 10,000 seamen talking far more languages than we knew anything about. Thus several days and nights passed away, and we found the people one of the most delightful in the world, frank, free, open-hearted, and generous, and hospitable to a fault. I'm told that there is not a heartier people on the face of the earth than the 500,000 inhabitants of Liverpool, and so far as my experience goes, that is quite true. We accepted several invitations and had glorious times among these people. We ran the whole town and saw many places of great interest and beauty. But from 15 to 20 miles of dock, the busy river and the great landing stage almost took our breath away. It is worth crossing the Atlantic to see the far famed city of Liverpool. Everybody saw and knew that we had a wedding party along with us, and indeed my 2 daughters and their husbands were just like so many birds set free when once they got ashore. Like the spirited singing birds of the British Isles, there was no end to their hilarity, and it was delightful to see them. Our entire party were very favorably impressed with all that we both heard and saw, and everybody was so very polite to us and agreeable in all their ways. We now began to make excursions to see some of the fine sights of old England, and some of the grand castles and palaces of fame and renown. What seemed to impress us almost was the smooth, lawn-like appearance of the whole fair-faced country, which is the most polished upon the face of the earth. Beautiful England indeed reminds me of a well-cultivated garden, and it looks like a great garden and nothing else. The houses and grounds of some of the nobility are flung open for the inspection of foreign visitors, and truly they are a delight to behold, with all their flower gardens, conservatories of plants, playing fountains, and other attractions too numerous to mention. Go where we might, nothing seemed more gratifying to our feelings than the polite attention and fine manners of all those with whom we came in contact, the sights and scenes round about us, and so much to charm the senses in a foreign land, in the delightful month of May, delighted us to the core, and made us think of the Garden of Eden, and the fabled golden regions of the blessed. The stately homes of England, how beautiful they stand, amidst the tall ancestral trees, o'er all the pleasant land. Such is England that has been polished for 1,000 years, till polishing can do no more. All the world has heard of beautiful Wales, and we determined to pass a few weeks among her enchanting scenery. We visited the Vale of Llangollen, the Vale of Clwyd, the Vale of Conway, saw Betws-y-Cwd, the pass of Llanberis, and indeed the best things in all North Wales, including lakes, rivers, waterfalls, and glorious romance without end. The warm-hearted, impulsive Welsh people almost carried us all off our feet with their unbounded enthusiasm and the tremendous warmth of their welcome. They are the greatest singers in the world. Indeed, all Wales is one sea of song, and they sing well, and they even dearly love to sing. They are a God-fearing race, and we never heard a Welshman swear, no, not even once. Here was something for our young people to learn, for it was so sweet to hear the name of the Lord mentioned only in terms of praise. Wales always reminded our entire party of the delectable mountains of the Pilgrim's Progress, for the Welsh mountains were delightful to us. After we got through with all we cared about seeing in beautiful Wales, and among its warm-hearted people, we next moved away to the north to become somewhat acquainted with what is truly called Bonnie Scotland. We passed around the highlands and the islands of that romantic country, and beheld the famous lakes and the lofty mountains, her deep waterfalls, and historic straits and glens. We visited the land of Burns in the south, or lowlands, saw Edinburgh and Glasgow, and the home of Sir Walter Scott on the lower Tweed. Of a truth, Scotland is a beautiful, enchanting, and enchanted land, and her warm-hearted, enthusiastic people stamp their impress on the hearts of all those who visit them for all coming time. We found the whole of the British Isles overrun with tourists in the summer-time, but few failed to see Scotland, which has filled the whole world with its fame. There is something so peculiarly romantic about the Scotch borders that our heads were almost turned, and where all the land seemed to be enchanted ground. Sweet Moffat and its grand surroundings can never be forgotten, nor the impression that they made on all our hearts. We also descended the beautiful Esk River from Llangollen till we came to headwaters upon Escadella-Moor, where the intelligent and hospitable people are mostly shepherds, and like all the rest of the Scotch, most exemplary in the attendance at church. The parish minister is the Reverend John C. Dick, and we were royally entertained by him to tea at the manse, and we had a good time generally. After leaving Scotland, we made our way over to Ireland, saw Belfast, Dublin, Cork, and lakes of Killarney. and indeed the best of all that was to be seen in the Emerald Isle. I don't know whether people can be too enthusiastic and warm-hearted, but if they can, these are the Irish at home. My good friend and brother, I began this long letter upon landing at Liverpool in May. It is now September 1876. We have all come back to Liverpool, to our first quarters here. We have had a glorious time roving over the British Isles these 4 eventful months. We intend to embark tomorrow on the Scotia for New York. I intend to keep a journal on our voyage, and yourself and lady shall have a reading of it at once. We are all quite well, and indeed the transatlantic trip has had the most salutary influence upon the health of our entire party. My next greatest desire is to return home to Buffalo, and we all hope to visit the British Isles at some future day, if God our lives shall spare. With our united love to yourself, lady, and all other friends, I am yours in all Christian affection, Beulah Lincoln. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Historical Romance of the American Negro by Charles Fowler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Eminent colored men and women: Bishop Daniel E. Payne, Frederick Douglass, His Life and Times, Mrs. Frances Ellen Harper, Miss Louise de Morty. One of the hardest things in the world is to keep down a man who is determined to rise. He comes up like a plant of spontaneous growth, and the more we try to keep him down, the more he will persevere in his determination to stand upon his own feet like other men. This was often shown in the days before the war, when the bold, intrepid slave, who clearly saw that the whole system was wrong, made up his mind at least to be free, and the next thing we hear of him is a daring and successful attempt to shake off the chains of slavery, through his successful escape to the free states of the North, or to Canada, or even to Europe. But this determined spirit to at least be free did not confine itself merely to such adventurous and successful escapes, but assumed the form of acquiring an education also. And no better illustration of this can be given than that of the late Bishop Daniel E. Payne of the AME Church, who was born in South Carolina in the year 1811. The heinous system of slavery in that rebellious state treated as a crime the teaching of any slave or free colored person whatsoever. But Daniel E. Payne had an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, and in order to flank the evil system that then prevailed, and to gain that knowledge to which he was as much entitled as the President of the United States himself, he procured the assistance of a friendly white man, who taught him in a cellar, where neither friend nor foe could see what they were doing. Daniel was an apt and clever student, and above all things, as the Bible says, he had a mind to work, and an enthusiastic mind at that. It did not take this young hero long to take in the entire situation regarding slave lands and slavery, when once his mind had begun to expand. Like Moses and many other famous leaders, the Lord had work for him to do, and he was preparing him for it at this time. Young Payne saw that South Carolina was no place for him, and that the first duty he owed to himself was to get away as best he could to the northern states, where he could enjoy his own manly and manful rights. As fortune favors the brave, he succeeded in making his escape, and his freedom being now secure, he made all due haste to become the eminent scholar who was destined by the will of God to become a leader and instructor of his people. He connected himself with the AME Church, and through and by means of that powerful body he did mighty things for the education of his own people, both before the war and after it. He has justly been called the apostle of education, and what the great Fred Douglass was in the political world, Daniel E. Payne was in the educational and intellectual world. Such a man as Bishop Payne should be revered as a philanthropist for all coming time. The colored race will never be able to say that they are out of his debt. At last he was made a bishop of his own church, and became the head of Wilberforce University in Ohio, a glorious institution that had made itself felt by its influence over all this nation. Bishop Paine was sent to Europe for a time in the interest of his church, and his high qualities were everywhere honored by the Christian and scholars across the Atlantic. Thus we see in Daniel Paine a diamond in the rough in the slave state of South Carolina, but by the predetermined will of God brought to the free North and polished, as it were, by the hand of the jeweler. We see all the work that the great Creator had given him to do, and how well he did it too. And what we have said of Paine could as well be said of thousands of others, men in whom the spirit of right and ambition dwells, men who ever forge to the front, men in whom God helps, because he sees that they are also willing to help themselves. We next come to the far-famed and highly celebrated Frederick Douglass, renowned over all the earth wherever honest worth is appreciated, and valued by the civilized sons and daughters of Adam. The name of Fred Douglass, as he is affectionately called, stands out in alto relief with that of John Bunyan, George Washington, and some few others who carry fame and goodness with them at one and the same time. Nobody seems to be jealous of them nor envy them, for their fame is far beyond the reach of jealousy or envy. It would be a difficult thing to find a village, valley, or an isle of any ocean on the face of the globe where the familiar, endearing name of Frederick Douglass has not been heard. The children growing up at their mother's knees have learned to lisp it as a name to be revered, and when they grow up to man's estate, nothing will content them until they have read the life of the famous Fred Douglass. The opinion, or rather the belief, has prevailed in America that Fred Douglass was the son of a white father and a colored mother, and that white father has been supposed to have been his owner. But in the history of his own life and times, published a few years ago, Douglass positively affirms that both his parents were colored, and for my own part I believe that to be the truth. As men like Fred Douglass are very few and far between, the wish among many of the anti-slavery school, at least, seems to have been father to the thought that so clever a man could never have been the offspring of colored parents, but that his father at least must have been white. Not so by any means. Fred himself makes it quite plain that his father and mother were both colored, and he tells us all about it in his usual modest way. Fred Douglass was born in the region called Tuckahoe Neck in Talbot County on the eastern shore of Maryland in the year 1817. There is something unusually sad and plaintive about the way in which the poor child was separated from his own father and mother, and how he came up on the rough side of the mountain of slavery. The poor lad was subjected not only to the purest barbarities, but had to undergo treatment that may be called sheer cowardice on the part of his tormentors. Well might the prophet exclaim, "How long, O Lord, how long?" Whilst he was a boy growing up at Baltimore, his mistress kindly taught him his letters, and went some way in giving him further instructions, till at last his master advised her to stop teaching him, as such things and slavery did not work well together. No, indeed, they did not work well together, especially in the heart and soul of a boy like Fred, who already began to look into the workings of the curse of slavery. To stop Fred from learning was now impossible. One might as well dam up a mountain rill with one's hands. It would simply flow over the top of them or round about them. Nature will have her way, and the great Creator had implanted the germ of liberty in the boy's heart, whose growth was not to be kept down. After many ups and downs on the eastern and western shores of Maryland, when our hero had arrived at about the age of 21 in the year 1838, he resolved to make a bold stroke for liberty, and accordingly, being dressed up like a sailor, he took the train at Baltimore for Philadelphia, luckily escaping detection, and having successfully run the gauntlet by the way, he landed upon the platform of the Quaker City all right. But he did not consider himself safe even here, so he left Philadelphia still dressed in his sailor's suit, and came on to the city of New York. Arise, shine forth, for thy light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon thee. Thus said the prophet, and Fred Douglass in his last book. The history of his life and times almost sets up a perfect yell of delight at having escaped from the horrors of slavery and being a free man. The few days he spent in New York City among the friends of the free must have been a perfect springtime of life to him. Free, free, free as the wild waves of the deep, free to go where he pleased and to read and study what he liked. Our glorious youthful Fred, this splendid, well-built, stout-bodied young man of 21, did a very sensible thing whilst in New York. He had a lady love at Baltimore, a free young woman of color named Anna, but before he moved a step further, he sent for her to come on to New York City. So to New York he came, and here the interesting young couple were married. This indeed was a very lively stroke of business on the part of Frederick, but he was now at the golden age of 21. It was best for him to marry now, because it would give him something to live and toil for, and also give ballast to his ship of life. The great Creator and his daughter Nature made no mistakes. My own marriage with my own beloved Tom has been no failure. We have never repented of it, either of us. We could have done no better. And so it was with Fred Douglass and his beloved Anna from Baltimore. There never was a more manly bridegroom than he. Above all things he was a Christian and a gentleman, in the very essence of his nature, a man of lofty honor and principle. And with such a man as that, a young woman is forever in safety. All this time, 1838, the abolitionists were under full swing, led on by William Lloyd Garrison of Massachusetts, and backed up by all those who beheld the dawn of freedom on the eastern horizon. Garrison's paper, The Liberator, sent forth its blasts all over the northern states, but the North at that time abode in thick darkness as to the rights of colored men to freedom, and on the self-same footing with themselves. And not only did thick darkness cover the land, but entire legions and hosts of the people were almost as much prejudiced upon the slave question as the slaveholders of the South. They had no more idea of the grand self-elevating capabilities of the colored race than the child that was unborn. And the ignorant masses of white people were certainly unwilling to give them a chance. And our poor dear Fred, now a married man, had just to stand his chances and run his risks with the rest, while the untutored North was in such a crude and chaotic state. Therefore, on account of the presence of so much ignorance and prejudice against men of color in New York City, the Friends of Freedom considered it unsafe for Frederick Douglass to remain there any longer, and advised him to move on to New Bedford in Massachusetts, where he would at least be out of danger. We can never forget the honored name of Mr. David Ruggles, a colored gentleman of New York City, in connection with these events. It was he who mainly took charge of our hero and his wife in New York City and sent them on to New Bedford. And when they arrived in New Bedford, they were met by one Mr. Nathan Johnson, a very intelligent and industrious colored man, a warm friend of theirs, who advanced them a sum of money to redeem their baggage, which was held for fair. He advised Fred to drop the name of Fred Lloyd and to call himself Fred, as Nathan Johnson had lately been reading of Douglass in Sir Walter Scott's novels relating to Scotland and the Scotch. Being now in possession of his freedom, having a sweet young wife and a home of his own, he had something to live for. Douglass had learned the trade of the shipbuilder at Baltimore, but was unable to work at that trade at New Bedford on account of the prejudices of the white workmen there against color, for had he taken his tools in among them and gone to work, they would all at once have stopped work and left the yard. Such was the character of even northern men in the year 1838, but Douglass was not the man to flinch. He was strong, hearty, and handy at almost everything. If he could not do one thing, he could do another, and therefore he picked up a living at anything that presented itself to him. The whole colored race are preeminently inquiring, and possess a thirst and love for knowledge in the very highest degree. Fred Douglass was a splendid specimen of this noble trait of character. Being now his own master, he literally devoured knowledge, and his splendid intellect expanded, flourished, and grew on apace like the growth of vegetation in the tropics. He was no longer watched or almost murdered. If he was found with a book in his hand, he was no longer the so-called property of a fellow calling himself his owner, who robbed him of his week's wages and then pretended to make him a present of a quarter of his own money to treat himself with. Oh, dear me, no. No more of that for him. When this brave young man, this hero of 21, had done his day's work, he came home to his beloved Anna at his cozy home in New Bedford, and after he had his supper, the way was clear for a grand time reading The Liberator, which William Lord Garrison sent out every week, and that fired the warm, receptive mind and heart of young Fred, so that his fame as a brilliant conversationalist and a well-read man spread rapidly throughout the town. He had been often listened to as an exhorter and unusually fervid speaker at the colored Methodist church in the town, and all men with sharp eyes perceived that another star had risen in the intellectual heavens, and that some circumstance or other would bring him to the front some day, and it came to pass as they had prophesied. In New Bedford, Mr. Douglas had attended several meetings in defense of the poor oppressed slave, and there he had heard the most unmitigated denunciation of the whole infamous system of slavery. The eloquent, burning language of the speakers went home to his heart. In the summer of 1841, when Douglas was 24 years old, an anti-slavery convention was to be held at Nantucket, Massachusetts, a place not far from New Bedford, and the convention would be under the management of the famous William Lloyd Garrison, whose weekly paper, The Liberator, Douglas had been devouring week by week with such unwonted avidity. He determined to take a little respite from his hard work in the brass foundry and attend this gathering of anti-slavery people. There was a great assemblage of people at Nantucket. The fires of enthusiasm on behalf of the oppressed slave burned hot and high. In the midst of the vast audience here assembled, there was one Mr. William C. Coffin, who had heard the eloquent and burning words of Frederick Douglass as he harangued the little audiences of the colored Methodist Church in New Bedford. Mr. Coffin sought out our unknown hero and gave him such a vigorous invitation to speak that his hesitancy and bashfulness and backwardness were all entirely overcome, and Fred Douglass, nothing daunted now, mounted the platform and made such an oration as filled every thinking man and woman with astonishment. His simple burning tale of his own wrongs and experiences completely swept his audience away, and like the Queen of Sheba, there seemed to be no more spirit left in them. Fred Douglass had come to stay. The name and fame of Fred Douglass arose like a brilliant and new star in the heavens. He began to travel and lecture in different parts of the New England states and paid visits to other sections of the North. His noble presence and splendid eloquence drew the eyes and ears of the whole country. His great name crossed the Atlantic and spread throughout the British Isles. His powerful pen in the columns of the Liberator and elsewhere added still further to his fame. Everybody who hated and detested slavery desired to see him and to hear him speak. He was a power in the anti-slavery party, and he himself laid the axe most willingly with all his might and main. The question arose, if one colored man can do so much, what can the whole race do if they were set at liberty? On account of the rising excitement all over the land on the slavery question in the year 1845, the friends of Mr. Douglass sent him to England. In crossing the North Atlantic, the passengers called upon him to make a speech on the question of slavery, and he complied. There were several gentlemen on board who most violently objected to any such attacks on their holy institution of slavery. But the captain was master of his own vessel and put down that southern mutiny with a strong hand. These pro-slavery gentlemen tried to justify their conduct afterwards in the London papers, but John Bull would not hear them, and it was simply a splendid advertisement for the fair name and fame of Mr. Douglass. For 2 years he traveled the British Isles speaking upon the subject of American slavery. He was received well everywhere, and the fine spreading plains of old England, the beautiful valleys of Wales, the green fields of Ireland, and the bold mountains of Scotland all rang with the illustrious name of Fred Douglass. Such a man as he was did not belong to the colored race alone, and to the United States. He belonged to the whole world and to all races. Such men can never be appropriated by one people, but they are indeed the common property of all. Douglass returned home and founded a paper called the North Star. He moved to Rochester, New York, and there he and his family took up their abode. The glorious work for the destruction of slavery went on, grew and increased, and at last brought on the War of Secession and freedom likewise for the entire enslaved race. Mr. Douglas then removed to Washington and was honored with high offices in the services of his native country. He had the misfortune of losing his darling Anna, though after 5 years he married again and went on a wedding tour to Europe and the East, this being his third voyage across the ocean. He died at Washington in February 1895 at the age of 78, no very great age, but then he had done the work of 10 men, and that wears human life rapidly away. Thousands of eminent men have arisen from the ranks of the colored race since 1865, and thousands are now upon their feet also. Their names have reached the ends of the earth. But Fred Douglass was early in the field, and he was a very, very bright particular star. Like John Bunyan, George Washington, and some few others, he shines for all time and for the entire human race. He did a mighty work for God and humanity. Of all those illustrious men who have been born of women, there has never arisen a greater man in all the annals of time than our congenial friend and brother, Fred Douglass. My dear reader, I have given but short sketches of 2 eminent colored men who elevated themselves head and shoulder above their fellows for the purpose of showing what the race can do. And I could go on to any length in the same strain and pick out and describe other eminent men whose fame has reached the ends of the earth, though not in the same degree as Fred Douglass. But I need not dwell further here in showing what we can do, especially now that we are set free, though the whole world freely admits that we have done well, and very well still. We are only now at the threshold of our advancement, for it is only 30-odd years since the close of the war. But in that short time we have beaten every other race in the way of progress, and the sun is only yet 1 hour above the horizon. By and by we shall have the full noonday. I have mentioned Fred Douglass and Daniel E. Payne, and it is only just that a couple of other representative women should be singled out to show what our women can do. We have had no bright particular star among the gentler sex like Fred Douglass among men, but still the colored race, like other peoples, can certainly boast of a splendid galaxy of eminent and clever women who only lack better education and wider and greater opportunities to shine more than they did. The women have so far not had the same chances as the men, but they are getting them now, and they are coming to the front one by one, coming out one here and another there, like the bright stars of the night. High school and colleges of all kinds are now thrown open for our daughters, and wherever there are genius and ability, they will forge to the front and make themselves known. Contemporaneous with Bishop Daniel E. Payne and Fred Douglass, we mention the name of Mrs. Frances Ellen Harper, who was born in Baltimore, Maryland, in the year 1825. Her home for many years has been the Queen City of Philadelphia. Mrs. Harper is a noble woman among women, and impresses all comers with her unusual natural sweetness and graceful ladylike ways. There is a deal of magnetism about her that attracts all those who hear her sweet, well-trained voice, and that draws us towards her by the comeliness of her graceful presence. We have all heard of a bundle of love, but Mrs. Frances Harper is a bundle of natural and cultivated intellect, and of refined and polished manners. Her sweetness draws us to her like the charming and fragrant rose in the flower garden. Born during the reign of slavery, when days were dark and friends were few, she did not have a right and proper opportunity of getting an early education as the young ladies are getting today. But all the same, the great Creator gave her talents, and she has had a thirst for knowledge and a mind to work. This, indeed, is half the battle, and sometimes much more than half. Mrs. Harper applied herself most vigorously to study as she was growing up in her teens, and by the time she had come to woman's estate, she was well educated. Thus we see that nobody need despair of becoming well educated, for we can all learn if we only have pluck and ambition and patience and perseverance with them to forge to the front like the lady in question. This eminent woman soon became widely known for her brilliant talents and all her sweet ladylike graces, and admonished all abolitionists and anti-slavery people what our race could do if they were once freed from their shackles. Mrs. Harper possessed a great natural fondness for poetry, which she proceeded early to cultivate, so that she had become well known for her sweet effusions in that line, and they have been published far and wide throughout the world, and prove that we have birds of song among us as well as others. She has written some pieces possessing much merit. She has a great natural facility for writing, and reminds me of a clause in Deborah's Song of Triumph in the 5th chapter of the book of Judges. Out of Lebanon came down those who handle the pen of the writer. For a facile, easy pen, Mrs. Frances Ellen Harper is a perfect Labulonite, for she has shown that she also can handle the pen of the writer. This gifted lady has also been a bright and shining light on the lecture platform, and indeed has appeared on many of the leading platforms of the nation, and crowned herself with honor and glory. She has proved to the whole world that a woman can do mighty deeds as well as man. There was a dark and doleful time in this world's history when a woman was regarded as little more than a mere serf for man's will and pleasure everywhere. But those dark ages have passed away, and women have advanced to the front line and taken their rightful places in the world. Mrs. Harper is a living proof of this nobility among women, and she has done yeoman service in trying to elevate her sisters of the colored race. Her splendid services will never be forgotten by either this generation or the generations to come. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. Louise de Morty of Norfolk, Virginia, was born of free parents in that place in the year 1833. As she was not allowed to receive an education at the home of her youth, she decided to go to Boston, where she could get one. It was in the year 1853 that she took up her residence in that city, when she was 20 years of age, with life and all its opportunities before her in a free state. At once she took a vigorous hold and availed herself of all favoring opportunities that presented themselves. She was a young maiden of great personal beauty, and possessed a sweet disposition and a most remarkably good memory. She took very high standing as a pupil in the schools and seminaries of Boston, and made a whole host of friends won over by her graces and accomplishments. In 1862 she came out as a public reader, and shone like a very brilliant star. She showed that she was a perfect elocutionist by birth, and had been polished like a rich jewel. Her natural beauty and personal graces, engaging manners, and richly toned voice drew the eyes of the whole country. Just as she had come to be well known, she heard of the great destitution among the colored orphans at New Orleans at the close of the war. Hither she hastened, and in 1867 raised funds to build an asylum for the colored people of that city. This she did in her spirit of Christian love, and she won the hearts of all those who beheld her like another angel of mercy at her good works. But the yellow fever struck her down on the 10th of October of the above year 1867, when she said so touchingly, "I belong to God our Father," and then expired. Thus was this brave young woman cut off in her 34th year, but she lived long enough to show to others a brilliant example that will never be forgotten. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Historical Romance of the American Negro by Charles Fowler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our first great men and women, new lights to the front, our own humble beginning in 1865, cleanliness and industry, music and song, immense progress in education, and a mighty advance along the whole line, the rapid increase of wealth, the crime of lynching, the church and Sunday school, the colored man's right to vote and to rule the nation. Though I've only sketched the lives of two most eminent members of color and two famous women of the same race, I must confess that I feel greatly tempted to go on with the subject and speak of many others, some of whom have gone to their reward, and others remain alive unto the present day. At first sight, the general reader might imagine that those first bright stars that shone in our intellectual firmament were brighter than the talented men and women whom we can see at this day and hour, walking up and down our streets, and shining like suns in their different professions, doing splendid service in elevating the colored race in America. We had Fred Douglass, Bishop Hayne, Mrs. Frances Ellen Harper, and some other bright particular stars who shone with apparently unusual brilliancy some 50 or 60 years ago, and they have been set down for the 7 wonders of the world. Fred Douglass, at least, was a genuine wonder for all time. But while we are inclined to look upon these worthies as towering geniuses and most extraordinary lights in the heavens in but recently bygone days, we forget that the thick darkness that surrounded them went a long way in making their brilliance and splendor appear far brighter than they really were. This is quite true of all races, and is no detraction whatever from the real merits that were justly their own. I'm safe in saying that 10,000 clever colored men and women, representing all the different arts and professions, could be picked out at this day, who would have passed for stars of the first magnitude had they made their appearance upon the stage of time some 50 or 60 years ago. To shine to the same extent of brilliancy and glory nowadays would indeed be a very difficult matter when the whole United States is flooded with a great tide of knowledge that was never known before. In these happy days of ours, knowledge covers the land as the waters cover the seas. It is perfectly laughable for me now to look back and remember the taunting expressions that were flung upon our dear people, saying that we had no originality, and that we could never rise above being mere imitators of the white man. In those days our people were in slavery and had no opportunities of showing what they were capable of doing. But now we are free, and we can all go to school, and education can polish us like other races in the same way as we polish the block of marble and cut out the precious jewels of all descriptions. If we leave a diamond in its rude, rough state like the colored race in the dark days of slavery, that diamond will continue to be rude and rough still. But place the precious stone in the hand of the jeweler, and we shall soon behold a bright and shining precious stone indeed. It was not only cruel, but it was cowardly to taunt a whole race of people with incapacity and lack of talent, when our enemies had our hands tied and were unwilling to give us a chance. But by the grace of God and the blood of the Americans, both white and black, we are now all free, and thousands upon thousands of our dear people have acquired splendid educations in all the different professions and walks of life, and they have proved to the whole world, both men and women, that there is talent and genius among our sons and daughters who have forged to the front, who are self-made men and women indeed. Men and women who have risen from the ranks just the same as officers and commanders start up from the ranks in the time of war. My dear reader, we are often told that poverty is no disgrace, but that it is very inconvenient, which is all true indeed, too true. And what is still worse, it often cannot be helped. In days not so long since gone by, we used to be taunted with poverty, but if we had no possessions of our own in the days of slavery, we at least, like the Apostle Paul, made others rich, and it was our oppressed people who built up the sunny South, the richest section of the United States before the war. If we had had all the wealth that was thus stolen away from us and given to those who led on the great rebellion, we would never have been turned loose with nothing in our hands in 1865, and to begin life anew at the lowermost round of the ladder of prosperity. It is very true that even in the days of slavery there were colored men scattered over all the free states of the Union, many of whom had amassed vast sums of money, and who were invariably treated with great respect and honor by white people because they were rich. So long as they had plenty of money, it was all right, and there was nothing either thought or said about the color of their skin. But if the whole race of colored people in the South were turned loose with nothing in 1865, they have at least made in the aggregate immense sums of money since then, and devoted it all to those noble purposes whereby the entire race has been raised up and elevated in the scale of nations. Above all other causes, religion and education have been thus spread all over the land, the money being supplied by a willing people whose good natural inclination to give has never been surpassed, and very seldom equaled by any race under the sun. Immense sums of money have been put away in savings banks, and property in land is a noble feature of the wisdom of our people in the South. Take them more than 8,000,000 colored people all over the Union, and behold what a vast number own their own houses and have money to their credit, stored up in banks against a rainy day. And then see the comfort, cleanliness, and order to be observed everywhere in an untold number of dwellings. The colored race are unusually fond of cleanliness and order in their nice and cozy, snug homes when they can get them. And take the United States all over today, it is most astonishing to behold such a number of beautiful and comfortable homes as there are. I think, dear reader, that our own people, taken as a whole, have been both industrious and thrifty since the close of the war, and as the Bible tells us, they have succeeded in building up the walls of Jerusalem, because they have had a mind to work. Wherever there is a will, there is a way. It is all very true that some among us are extravagant, lazy, shiftless, but that is quite true of the white race, too, only I think more so, and we never condemn a whole race for the faults of a few. Let us then judge fairly and award to the colored race what belongs to them by right. As in the days of slavery, so at the present day it is the colored man who still extracts the wealth from the soil of the South, partly for himself and partly for the white man. He can stand the heat of the sun far better than the white tiller of the soil, and it seems that the rich white man would rather have him than the other. In the days of slavery we had to do the best we could. We had no Vanderbilt palaces to live in then, but now we have at least lots of comforts, nice furniture, carpets, pictures hanging from our walls, whole libraries on our bookshelves, and hundreds of other things too numerous to mention. Music and song are more or less bound up with the history of every nation of which we have ever heard or read. Away back in the dark night of slavery in America, the slaves in the field used to sing their mournful, plaintive, yet musical ditties to lighten their heavy labors and cheer up their hearts. These ditties were songs and prayers at one and the same time. In the day of his distress, the African never forgot the God who brought Israel out of Egypt, and we know quite well that many of our own people confidently expected that day of happy deliverance that came at last to all. Therefore they sang praises unto the Lord God of Israel, and like the psalmist they prayed and sang at the same time. And we have it plainly on record that they had powerful lungs and most wonderfully rich voices, showing in advance what great and famous singers they would become if their musical talents were only fully developed like others. I have already spoken of the Jubilee minstrels, who were mostly born in slavery, many of whom, indeed, came up by the rough side of the mountain, and yet who possessed such a wealth of music and song within themselves that they surprised the whole country and even crossed the North Atlantic, and rendered themselves illustrious for all coming time by performing and singing before Queen Victoria, the grandees and general population of the British Isles, and some of the royal families and magnates and peoples of continental Europe. This was honor indeed with a vengeance. Old England and all the rest cared nothing for the color of the skin. They all at once set their seals upon the wonderful talents of the colored race in musical line, and there was rejoicing among freedom's friends over all the earth. The time would fail to mention the names of all those eminent singers who have made themselves illustrious in these latter days in this country, and not in this country alone, but they have crossed the wide oceans in ships and sung before the admiring audiences of many a foreign land. But among all these great singers of our race who have thus distinguished themselves, I will simply mention the name of Miss Flora Batson, who has justly been called the Jenny Lind of America, and she can sing indeed before any audience in this nation, a veritable nightingale and queen of song. But leaving her and a whole host of other warblers on one side, there is a grandeur in singing of our church members and congregations on the Sabbath day that has become the standing wonder of the country, and it is my own deliberate opinion, and the openly confessed opinion of many of the white race, that for music and song at least we have no equals in the United States. I think we may safely claim that not only can we play and sing, but we can play and sing well. there arising from the great congregation a grand volume of music and song that reminds me of the voice of many waters mentioned in the Revelations, a volume of song rising from powerful lungs and helped on by the warm feelings and enthusiasm of the race. And as our oppressed forefathers whiled away the long hours in the field and lightened their labors by singing, so our people nowadays bring home the latest new hymn or fine anthem of praise, and sing them at home to brighten up their domestic cares, and find a vent for that joyous nature and devotional enthusiasm for which the colored race are famed over all the earth. The greatest blot at the present time upon the fair fame and name of the internal and domestic doings of the United States, as it appears to me, is lynching. And this lynching is not confined to any particular race or any particular crime, but we find to a greater or less degree all over the land, from the lakes to the Gulf, a mob spirit among the people to take the law into their own hands whenever any flagrant breach of law occurs, and hang their victim on the nearest tree. The mob is unwilling to leave the matter in the hands of the regularly constituted authorities, and proceeds to murder the supposed criminal in its own way. I say supposed criminal because the man they are hunting after is often not the right man at all. An innocent man is put to death, and the guilty man escapes. It has also been proven beyond the shadow of a doubt, because we have all seen the records of the same in the public papers at the time, that white men have been in the habit of blackening their faces when about to commit some heinous offense, and thus tried to produce the impression that the guilty party was a colored man and not a white man at all. Cases have thus occurred where innocent colored men have been lynched, and the real criminals made their escape by simply discoloring their faces. There is hardly a week passes but we find the hurrying mobs themselves discovering their own mistakes, sometimes in time to prevent the execution, but at other times too late. It is very true that on many occasions the really guilty party is taken, confesses his crime, and is duly executed by the wild and unruly mob of lynchers. The chief fault, as it appears to my mind, is a lack of firmness on the part of the States, and I might also add of the central government at Washington. It is a perfect scandal to a duly constituted government to say that they are not able to carry out the law or let the law take its course. Who would believe for a moment that England or Russia would allow any and every wild mob to take their victims out of the hands of the police, and in fact administer the law for them? Such a test of home authority would never run on for 24 hours in any foreign civilized land. If the governors and the authorities would show a proper amount of firmness, and the central government at Washington would tighten up the screws a little, all these lynchings would come to an end, and such a thing would be heard of no more. With regard to the Southern States, at least, where lynchings have been more common, the taunting question has been asked by foreign nations: are the Southern States fit for civilization, and ought they to be depended on to govern themselves? Well, I think they are fit for self-government, but the screws ought to be tightened up considerably, and I think the sooner the better. If I had any power to advise the houses at Washington, I would advise them to take the scandal of lynching by the wild mobs into their own hands and put a stop to it in their own way. And let Congress see that all races and crimes are treated alike, and let the duly constituted authorities of the states administer the laws for which they are appointed and paid. Lynching is not only a breach of the law, but it is murder itself, and a horrible system of crime and public disorder that have brought this most shameful nation into great disrepute. Let us hope and pray that something may be done very soon to bring this national scandal to an end, and let public murder by infuriated mobs come to an end and be heard of no more. In the books which Fred Douglass wrote of his life and times, he always mentions the miserable and doleful processions of slaves who were driven during the darkness of the night from the pens into which they had been gathered in Baltimore to the vessels which were to sail with them to Georgia, and other scenes of toil and exhaustion in the far distant South. Alas, alas, the sunny South had no joys for them, and as they passed through the streets of Baltimore during the night, they wailed and lamented their hard fate. This leads me on to reflect, my dear reader, upon the gloriously altered state of affairs that freedom has brought around, and which we can see all around about us at the present day. One of the grandest sights that delights our eyes now is the great array of Sunday schools in every state and county of the United States. I've always called the Sunday school the children's church, and it is the children's church indeed, and a glorious church at that too, far and wide, spread over all this broad land, running all along the way from the wild Atlantic to the mild Pacific, and from the lakes to the Gulf. Young, well-dressed boys and girls in thousands and tens of thousands may be seen wending their happy way to their own dearly beloved children's church. I mean their Sunday school. The great and powerful, widespread Methodist, Baptist, and other grand churches, organized and carried on by the colored race to the utmost limits of the American Union, deserve the utmost praise for pains and labors they have been at to make such splendid provision for the rising generation of boys and girls who thus go forth upon the Sabbath day to worship the Lord in their own youthful, sweet, and attractive way, well taught by devoted men and women who rear their tender vines and watch over them and tend them well, as the careful and skillful gardener tends and ripens his precious plants in the hothouse. What a glorious change for the better, my dear reader, has come over this federal union of ours in our own day. Well did the Jubilee minstrels sing before the royal family of England, "No more auction blocks for me," for at the present day, instead of auction blocks and wronged and oppressed slaves being conveyed in a fugitive way under cover of the darkness of the night from their pens to the ships, wailing and lamenting their sad fate in the self-same city of Baltimore at the present time, thousands and tens of thousands of children and men and women wend their peaceful way to Sunday school and church, walking the streets of the city in love and peace on their pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the city of the great King. And yet, if anybody had told the slaveholder only 50 years ago that his darling peculiar institution was on its last legs, he would probably there and then have caused us to be lynched for our rashness of speech. As I have mentioned already in this book, preachers in the South in those days had even the audacity to preach sermons in the defense of slavery, and they were so bold as to select for their text, "This," meaning slavery, "is the Lord's doings, and it is wonderful in our eyes." Very wonderful indeed, I should say, and the war for the extinction of slavery was the Lord's doing too, I suppose, and it also was wonderful in our eyes indeed. If those miserable slave traders were to rise from their graves today, were to hear colored minstrels singing in the courts of Europe, "No more auction blocks for me," and then were to see millions of colored children, youths, and maidens wending their way to the happy Sunday schools on the day of rest, even they also would be compelled to admire the great changes for the better, and to exclaim in a different sense, "Truly these are the Lord's doings, and they are wonderful in our eyes." It has always been a matter of personal interest and importance for men to take a hand in voting and the ruling of their native state. Universal history shows us plainly that this has always been the case, unless indeed the nation was a monarchy, and therefore subject to the unlimited will and pleasure of one man as despot in chief, and those who served under him and did as they were commanded. But in those lands where freedom ruled in the days of old, and all countries today where constitutional government prevails, men have always voted in one form or another, and they still lend a hand at elections, and this without regard to race, color, or any such thing. Neither has there ever been any friction or trouble in legislative assemblies, and there is none now in foreign nations where men of different races, colors, and even creeds take their seats side by side and proceed to work together for the good of all citizens. We all know how it was in the South in the early years of Reconstruction after the close of the war, when the state legislatures were composed of white and colored men who ruled the states together. We thought at the time that this thing would go on, and that all parties had settled down in peace and harmony for every man to vote as he pleased, and to send such men, black or white, to represent them in their legislatures as were returned by the largest number of voters at the elections, conducted according to the Constitution of the nation. But the white man of the South had almost always been accustomed to his own selfish, despotic way and sway in the days of slavery. The South had not only the rule of colored men, but even over white men in the halls of Congress. Unless that section of the Union could have her own dictatorial way, there was no peace whatever in the House. The North therefore felt herself often obliged to give way, which encouraged the South to take a mile the next time when we gave her an L. I have shown the reader of these pages how the Ku Klux Klan arose, how the new shotgun policy brought the Republican government of secession to an end, and how the very amendments to the Constitution, including the bare privilege of casting one's own vote, were all brought to an end. Nay, more than that, the reader knows by this time how an immense number of colored men, women, and children tore up stakes and left the states of the South where they were born, and sought new homes in northern and western states where the shotgun policy of the late rebels did not prevail. But where are representatives in Congress today, and where are the colored senators and others in the legislative halls of the Southern states? For the present they have been wiped out, and so far Uncle Sam has given way and backed down once more to the violent South for the sake of keeping peace in the House. It may be argued that coming but recently out of slavery as we did, we were unfitted for the full privilege of freemen and voters. Perhaps there is some reason in that view of the question. As a nation, we certainly could not be expected to be college-bred in 1865, but that is over 30 years ago, and both we ourselves and our children have been to almost all the schools, seminaries, and colleges in the land since then. If we were ignorant in 1865, sure we cannot as a race be called ignorant now. In my own opinion, I think it is about time that the last 3 amendments of the Constitution were now carried out to the fullest extent, and that we should be no longer contented merely to vote for the white man, but vote for colored men too, who run for office. As the South has been so violent over the matter of ruling her own states to the exclusion of the colored man, the grand hue and cry among some of our own people has been raised, let politics alone and attend to your own business and let the white man rule. So far as I can see, there is neither sense nor justice in such a cry as that. If the white man has a right to vote, so has the colored man. To stuff the ballot boxes with manufactured votes, or to throw out those that colored men have voted, is simply breaking the law, and the central government should punish it as such. If an ambitious young colored man desires to represent his country in the field of politics, it stands neither in law nor reason for any white man to presume to stop him. If he be a man of great talent like Frederick Douglass or John M. Langston or Blanche K. Bruce, that is just so much more the reason why he should go to Congress or represent his own country and state at home. The colored man must receive every fair play at the elections. His vote must not be tampered with any more than the white man's vote. By all means let him have his vote, for he will never be satisfied with anything less. Let every infringement of the law be pushed to the utmost extent. Let a few examples be made, and tampering with other men's votes will come to an end. For the very life of me, I can see no reason why colored men should abstain from politics any more than white men. There is no reason why they should do so if they wish to enter into political life. We can also attend to other business at home, like the rest of the population. To discharge our duties at the polls, indeed, is one of the very first duties of every citizen, and we have a perfect right to vote under the law of the land. Every now and then some surviving rebel in South Carolina or some other of the late seceded states takes upon himself to raise the old parrot cry, "This is a white man's government. Colored men shall not rule with us." If the national government did its full duty, it would arrest such a man as this for trying to teach the rising generation falsehoods and for disturbing the minds of the lieges. This is not a white man's country, nor a black man's country, nor a red man's country, but it belongs to all alike. We have only to go back 400 years when this country belonged to the Indians, and if it belongs by right to anybody at all, it belongs to them. But Spaniards, Frenchmen, Englishmen, and others came over the sea. They murdered or drove back the Indians and stole away their lands. Then the self-same Europeans went to Africa and killed and kidnapped the nations, and by physical force brought our ancestors here. And here we are at the present day. The War of Revolution came. The colonists secured their own freedom, but they did not set their own slaves free. They complained that they were in subjection under the King of England, but they winked at the thraldom of our ancestors and left us to languish in chains and slavery till the Lord sent the Civil War and made us all free, while the 3 amendments of the Constitution put us on the same footing with white citizens, and here we are in our own country, part and parcel of the entire American population. This country, then, either belongs to the Lord from heaven, or it is the property of the North American Indian, or else it has become, in some way or other, the property of the whole of us. We had better not examine into our rights too closely, for we cannot go back more than 400 years to establish our claims, and 400 years will not go for much, especially with the owner, the Lord of heaven. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Historical Romance of the American Negro by Charles Fowler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A general review of the writer's entire life and work, an optimistic view of the whole subject, with reflections and observations and forecasts of the near future. When I left the place where I was born in the year 1855 and made my lucky escape to a land of freedom in company with my fiancé, Thomas Lincoln, I had no idea whatever of the future that lay before us and of all the pleasant ways by which the Lord would lead us. It was well for both my darling Tom and me that we were the children of religious mothers who taught us from our earliest infancy to love the Lord at all times and to put our entire trust and confidence in Him. Tom and I had been accustomed to a delightful home at Riverside Hall on the banks of the Ohio, and we knew nothing about the evils of slavery like millions of others. In the midst of such pleasant surroundings on the banks of the beautiful river, it seemed easy enough for us at the time to love the Lord and put our trust in Him. But whilst the great Creator was working out His sure decrees, we considered ourselves perfectly justified in taking the law into our own hands, and whereas we could not get our rights by fair means, to take them by foul. It has been well for Tom and me that we acted as we did, and the blessings thus vouchsafed to us in that way have descended to our dear children in a full state of freedom. But while we had little risks to run compared to many refugees, there were millions left behind us who could not get along. For what could frail and feeble women do, surrounded as they were by every device and scheme that slavery and Satan could invent to keep their hold on what they presumptuously call their property? Thus our distressed brothers and sisters were obliged to wait for the coming of the Lord, and the wisest among them knew that His coming could not be long delayed, because the signs of the times pointed to a speedy deliverance, and a child could almost hear the loud and heavy rumblings in the heavens. But, my dear reader, the Lord works in mysterious ways His wonders to perform. We fondly expected and hoped to see freedom in our own day, some sweet day, but our minds were little prepared for its coming so soon. We heard the rumblings of the storm, indeed, but there had been other storms before, and they had blown over, and why should not this one go the same as they? That is the way that we poor, limited, erring human beings are likely to go aside and miss the mark. We judged of the rising storm of 1860 that it would be like those that had gone before it, but there was not a single being on the face of the earth who ever dreamed that we were at last drifting into a mighty war that was to continue for over 4 years, and would sweep away slavery and all its belongings, as the mighty tides of the ocean wash away the footprints on the sands. It became clear as time and war went on that the Almighty Ruler of the universe had risen up to strike the earth, and that He would not smite a second blow, but finish things up now. He says in His sacred word that He will hear our prayers. Our oppressed people have been crying to Him for many years. How long, O Lord, how long? The prayers of the distressed, their tears and cries have been heard. They had all been duly chronicled in heaven. The day for settlement with the slaveholders had now fully come, and one of those mighty changes that have followed each other these last 40 years with such rapidity was now at the door. Like the prompt railroad train, or better still, the tide of the sea, the Lord of heaven and earth was ready and armed from head to foot. Freedom was at the door, indeed and in truth, and the doors must be opened that captives should go free. What hath not God wrought? Those more than 4 decisive years, so heavy with fate and destiny, looked long, very long, in passing, but they brought changes to the entire colored race, both collectively and individually. And as slavery had grown more and more, even down to the very year when the war began, so was the joy all the greater when it was all over, and bright, shining freedom came suddenly at last. There was joy and rejoicing all over the United States at the result, dancing and singing from the Potomac to the Rio Grande in particular. So much for the whole race taken collectively. To us individually as a family, that mighty upheaval, the war, brought great and varied experiences, both sorrows and joy. When the first rush of wild enthusiasm against the rebellion was over, we all found out that we had to settle down to hard work, and 4 full years of war and fighting were before us. Thus the children and I saw Tom leave for the seat of war, and after many a hard-fought field, Tom was wounded so badly that he lay for a long time at New Orleans. We had done an immense quantity of correspondence by this time, but more changes wrought through and by the war were at hand. The whole American nation was undergoing changes, and so were we. The children and I longed with all our hearts to see husband and father once more. He was not yet well enough to travel to Buffalo. Indeed, the military authorities forbade it. And so we 3 determined to tear up stakes at Buffalo for a time and make a sudden and unexpected march on the city of New Orleans. This was not my first visit to the Crescent City of the sunny South. As my dear reader is already well aware, I went there about the year 1856 and rescued my dear mother from slavery, which I consider one of the very best things that ever I did in this world. This journey to New Orleans was a most glorious experience for the girls in particular, and they are even talking of it now. When we were in the lower Mississippi, we had a good time to look about us and see what a mighty work the sword of the North had already done for that section of the Union. The colored people were all free, and thousands were flocking to schools just newly set up, and learning as people had never learned before. The rebels and all those that sympathized with them used to say that if the slaves were set free, they would turn in and massacre their former owners and become regular heathens and savages. This was, of course, nothing but a silly parrot cry that nobody seriously believed, as no colored man had any other intention than to become a peaceable citizen. But during our delightful residence in the sunny South, we saw those who had been slaves in that section all working away upon the lands and in the towns and cities in perfect freedom, and their lives were both orderly and exemplary. But what surprised us most was to see them going to work with first readers, spelling books, slates and pencils, and all the other appliances of education, and gathering knowledge like the sands of the sea. This indeed augured well for the future, to see people even 70 and 80 years of age learning to read, write, and figure like the rest. Here was a field of bright promise for the near future. Here was a race of people just set free, grasping at the lowermost round of the ladder of education, and ambitious to mount higher every day. Behold, indeed, the mighty changes that the Lord has brought about in this dear land of ours. We have already lived long enough not only to see all the captives set free, but a second generation, 50% of whom are armed from head to foot, so to speak, with education. We have already brilliant men and women, competent to shine like stars in all the different walks and departments of life, which my 2 girls and I saw such abundant promise when we went to Louisiana. In due course of time, Tom was pronounced completely cured, was discharged from the hospital, and our 2 precious children and we took our homeward journey by way of the Gulf of Mexico, the city of Havana in Cuba, West Indies, and the Atlantic Ocean to New York, after which we took the train for Buffalo, where we all arrived safe and sound in due time, and had such a welcome home as is still green in our memories. This sea voyage and land journey were delightful experiences in the young lives of our two daughters, and showed them what a great, varied, and beautiful world the great Creator had made. We thanked him with full and grateful hearts for having laid our lines in such pleasant places, and giving us this sweet home of ours at Buffalo, where we have resided in peace, pleasure, and plenty. Lo, these many years, and we are at Buffalo still. It is a great comfort to our hearts and minds to think that the entire colored race are no longer compelled to reside, to dwell, and sleep where they are bidden, as in the bad old times of slavery, but that here again a mighty change for the better has come over all our people, inasmuch as many of them nowadays have comfortable and pleasant homes of their own, where beautiful furniture and musical instruments can be seen, yes, even fine pianos, along which the supple fingers of the rising generation can fly with the best. I bless and praise the goodness of the Lord for all these changes for the better. Instead of operating on the fiddle and the banjo, our clever musical sons and daughters can sing lovely accompaniments to the piano and the organ. The race is full of music, and their fame has reached the ends of the earth. Our churches and other institutions have a great name for sacred music and song, and I've heard good judges among the white population declare that there are no such singers as the colored race in the United States. We may at least congratulate ourselves that the entire press of the United States and the British Isles have completely endorsed the above sentiments of my own, and therefore I do not think that any conscientious man will dispute them. It is an old and a true saying that variety is the spice of life, and the beauties of the different races of people appear to the greatest advantage where their separate traits of character most differ from one another. Music and song, indeed, are quite a distinguished feature in the colored race, and there again we have seen mighty changes wrought out through and by our freedom, and again I thank the goodness of the Lord for even such changes as these. And yet we are only at the beginning of our improvements, associated as we also are with the white race of the United States, one of the most talented and ingenious peoples that the world has ever seen. It is well for us in a way that we are so associated, because our progress in these past years and at the present time is all the greater on that account. And yet when we consider that it is only yesterday, as it were, that all our people were set free, that our unbroken progress is still going on along the whole line, and that our progress will continue to be more marked in the future as the years go by, who can tell to what glorious heights of elevation our people shall attain, even within the next 20 or 25 years. Because in our own day and generation all the arts and sciences seem to be coming to the front. Learning, education, and inventions are farther and farther advanced day by day, and every kind of improvement grows and flourishes like the green bay tree. Progress indeed must be made. Things will not go backwards, but must go forward, onward, and upward. Such is the inevitable fate of the colored race, with so very much accomplished already, with 50% of our entire people throughout the whole Union who can read and write and work arithmetic. We may well wonder at the advancements still in store for our race, when education shall cover the whole land as the waters cover the sea. When the remaining 50% who are still destitute of education are brought into the fold, as it were, and an ignorant colored man or woman will be difficult to find in our nation. The unparalleled progress that we have made reminds me of the progress of a great river. Take, for example, the Mississippi. How small it is when it issues from Lake Itasca, away up at its headwaters in Minnesota. It is of truth very small indeed when it begins its journey to the sea, but the river advances boldly upon its long way, and keeps on, and still on, while every now and then a branch comes flowing in, now on the right hand, now on the left, sometimes nothing but a small rivulet, then a large and swelling stream. Thus the Mississippi still keeps advancing on mile after mile on its journey, till the great Ohio swells its waters, and then the greater Missouri comes rolling down from the Rocky Mountains, and now the Mississippi is growing large indeed, yes, very large. And here comes the Arkansas and the Red River with many smaller streams from the east, and thus the mighty Mississippi that began so small in Lake Itasca has now reached the Crescent City, and whole fleets of ships can float upon its bosom before its great and swelling waters reach the Gulf of Mexico. And thus it is with the advancement that has already been made by the colored race along the whole line. We began indeed very small in the year 1865, when the war closed and the appliances of education and improvement were put into our hands. But here is the year 1902, and like the Mississippi River, we have advanced far, very far upon our way, and yet we have by no means attained the goal of our expectations by any means, but great changes are underway, and we are still advancing. Many travelers have left it on record how they turned round upon the ever-ascending mountain way to mark progress and see how far they had come. Then with fresh resolution they again turned their faces to the road that still lay before and above them, and that with renewed interest and courage. I don't know how it may be with anybody else, but as I am now about 60 years of age, I am at times given to look back and to muse not only over all the way the Lord has led me, but also how he has led the entire race in my own days. The rising generation knows little of the thoughts and feelings and the sufferings of their fathers and mothers on their way to freedom and the present happy conditions of things. But I am like that mountain traveler of whom I have just spoken, and I sit at times and muse upon the tremendous excitement all over the North on the slavery question, and how the abolitionists demanded freedom and the South would not listen to any such thing. Then my mind runs back to Fred Douglass, Henry Ward Beecher, and all those heroes and heroines who fought the good cause of liberty and were faithful unto the end. We were in for a great and stirring time. Little does the present generation know of the times we went through in the years immediately before the war, when I used to travel over the states of the North, assisting in the lecturing and agitation against slavery. It is a very great gratification to me nowadays to look back and think of all the wonders of that most wonderful and lengthened campaign, when William Lloyd Garrison and all the other big guns were thundering away, and the discharge of their mighty artillery shook all the land, even to the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not so strong and supple in body now as I was in those glorious halcyon days, but I praise and bless the Lord that I was then endowed with health and strength and vigorous life to lay on the axe of liberty and to help bring down that foul and deadly upas tree called slavery, that was the curse of the whole land, the public disgrace of the United States. Since then I have contributed many articles to the papers and magazines of the day to help my own people to rise up and start upon their feet, but there is nothing that I ever did that left so much pleasure upon my memory as the campaign wherein I played, sang, and lectured against slavery in the South. Well, to be sure, how the surging crowds did come. It was a wonderful time that we had. The excitement was also most exhilarating, but above all, those mighty changes were on the road that we see around us today. The Lord has done great things for us already, and still we can say that there is a good time coming. Upon the whole, my life has been a happy one, at least as happy as could be expected in this shady world of ours, wherever changing clouds and sunshine chase each other all through our pilgrim journey to our home in heaven. I've tried to make the best of things and to consign myself to the Lord's will as nearly as my infirmities will let me. Mercy and goodness have followed me all the days of my life, and I've been most abundantly blessed by the Lord above all that I could either ask or think. My dear reader will no doubt think that I am in a very contemplative frame of mind at the present time, thus looking back and musing upon the active years of my past life. No doubt the greater part of life's long day has gone by, and the evening and night are coming on. But in my time I have learned to trust in God, to lay hold upon eternal life, to keep hope alive in my heart for all times, for myself and all my people, not only my immediate family, but the entire colored race. I'm therefore able to look forward with calmness and even joy to the time when the great Lord will take me home to himself. But still, as the evening and shadows of life are coming on, I will converse with my own family and friends upon the stirring events of the past years, and keep musing upon them also. If variety is the spice of life, I'm sure I've had plenty of it for my own part. I could never complain of the want of variety, and it has been a downright blessing to me too, for it has added to my knowledge and blessing in every way. My travels and varied experiences have brought me into contact with strange and interesting peoples, and countless individuals worth far more than their weight in gold. My many delightful journeys to the dearly beloved friends in Canada and their return visits to me have been like glorious rainbows that span the heavens of my happiness on earth. Then there is the permanent love and friendship of the many brave and true hearts that have thrown light and pleasure upon my path all along the line, good and faithful friends who assisted in pulling down the powers of slavery, and who now rejoice in common with myself that the mighty work was done at last, and that all our grand destiny is still before us. Thank God for this splendid prospect before us. It has been the joy of my life to see the improvements introduced into the American Constitution in our favor, and the celebration of the 15th Amendment all over the land, including the one we took a part in at Louisville, Kentucky, was a series of brilliant events that can never be forgotten. As I am by nature a great lover of the ocean, I've made 2 voyages from New Orleans to New York, and have even crossed the great Atlantic and visited the British Isles upon the happy occasion when my daughters were married. But above all things I have had the pleasure of seeing the entire colored race set free, have seen them make incredible advances in every walk and department of life, and the promise is held out that they will go on in the path of progress. We must still trust in God and ourselves, and march forward. And now, my dear reader, wishing for you all that is good, health, and prosperity, I am yours most sincerely, Beulah Lincoln Finney. End of chapter 21. Section 22 of Historical Romance of the American Negro by Charles Fowler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapters 1 and 2 of the American-Spanish War. Indulgent reader, I had grown accustomed to think that I should now live and die and never see any more war, either foreign or domestic, on the part of the United States. All things were running smoothly on the part of our nation, and there hardly appeared the most distant cloud in our peaceful-looking skies. But, as Robert Burns, the famous Scotch poet, most truthfully says, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glee, and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. In the month of February, 1895, the oppressed and robbed people of Cuba once more raised the standard of rebellion against Spain, and entered upon another struggle with the mother country. The tyrant Spain had broken all the promises she had made at the close of the 10 years Cuban War in 1878, and thus it came to pass, after an useless truce of 17 years, that the Cuban leaders once more decided to raise the standard of rebellion against the tyrant, considering it better to die in a war for freedom than to sit down any longer in a state of endless oppression. As our own nation had had a fearful war with England in the days of George Washington, a war that lasted over 7 years, all citizens of the United States felt a great deal of sympathy for the Cuban leaders and for all the Cuban people, a people who now devoted their lives unto death on the high places of the field. And myself, my own family, and all my beloved race felt very, very deeply for them. And not only did the people of the United States, but all lovers of freedom throughout the world felt the greatest sympathy for the Cubans. Thus long, weary months came and went, and poor, proud, decrepit old Spain, in her antiquated way, continued to borrow many millions of money at home and abroad, till at last, pobre España, poor Spain, was hardly able to pay the mere interest upon the money she had borrowed, let alone the principal. The patriotic Cubans fought long, well, and nobly. So did the Spaniards, but no real advantage was ever gained upon either side, because the Cubans had neither seaport nor fleet, and were never able to get the Spaniards out of their ancient and powerful fortifications, whilst the Spaniards were never able to beat the Cubans off the field, get them out of their strongholds among the mountains and their inaccessible retreats amidst their grand primeval forests. The Cubans of the United States, assisted by many of our own people, gathered money and loaded filibustering vessels that ran the feeble Spanish blockade off the island, and safely landed an untold number of cargoes of arms and ammunition for the struggling patriots, while our own national feeling against Spain still increased as the days went by. It is very true that the government of the United States did all that it was able to preserve neutrality and to keep the peace with Spain. Nay, more than that, we were at last obliged even to police the seas around the southern states to prevent those blockade runners from slipping away from our parts with their loads of arms and ammunition for that devoted island, and we were hardly able to stop them when we had done our best. Thus we were put to endless trouble to watch the seas for a foreign and cruel country, and that country was always laying complaints at our doors because we could watch no better. When Campos was Captain General of Cuba, the war for independence in that unhappy island was conducted with some regard to decency and civilized ways. But the Spanish arms made no progress, and the mother country sent over the cruel General Weyler, usually called the Butcher, and gave him a free hand in putting down the islanders any way he saw fit. The mind of this bad man seems to have been imbued with all the old Spanish cruelties of the Dark Ages, and all that tiger-like love for cruelty and bloodshed for which Spain and the Spaniards have always been so notorious. The readers of the public press are no doubt well aware already of the treacherous acts, cruelties, and medieval deeds of barbarism to which that monster and his soldiers resorted for the purpose of suppressing the Cuban rebellion. The worst of them all was his gathering the country people into seacoast towns and cities, mainly women, children, and old men, where they subsequently died by tens of thousands, and thus the poor, oppressed Cuban nation was weakened at last to the number of at least 200,000, if not more. And by such cold-blooded deeds, and others on a smaller scale, quite as cruel, did that black-hearted Spanish butcher wear down the population of Cuba. He made war upon nature and shocked the moral sense of the whole world, and yet this Weyler had the entire approval of the mother country, while he thus caused the non-combatant part of the Cubans to perish, when they had the unblushing impudence to carry on the barbarities of the Dark Ages all over the island of Cuba and right before our front door. The false and wilfully lying messages that even this butcher sent home to Spain from day to day about victories that he had gained over the insurgents were usually contradicted by the American and other foreign presses next day. Weyler excelled in nothing but writing false dispatches, while the hatred against him increased both in Congress and all over the United States. So great indeed was the outcry against the Spaniards that the proud and scornful Dons kept sending more and more soldiers over the Atlantic to give us to understand by that if we Americans dared to interfere between her and what she called the ever-faithful Isle, she would there fight Uncle Sam to the death and never surrender Cuba. Captain General Weyler's want of success, his cruelties, and countless false reports were at last so revolting to the feelings of Uncle Sam that Spain decided to withdraw her faithful butcher and send another Captain General over, and his name was General Blanco. He was admonished to bring the Cuban leaders and the Cubans to terms by wiles, bribes, and flattery, but the patriotic Cubans refused to swallow any such baits, and war went on the same as before, all our trade with Cuba being now destroyed, almost the whole island being reduced to the condition of a wilderness, while the silence of the grave seemed supreme everywhere. Spain continued to make more and more fresh promises from month to month, both to ourselves and to the Cubans, promises made in deceit and craft, which she never meant to fulfill. It is calculated that at one time there were 200,000 Spanish soldiers in Cuba, when the Cuban troops became so numerous that they even threatened Havana and whipped the Spanish outposts in the suburbs of the stronghold. Affairs at last became so unsafe and threatening for the numerous American colonists in Havana and throughout Cuba that the United States battleship Maine was sent to the island by way of protection, and she was duly anchored by the direction of the port authorities in a certain specified position within the harbor of Havana. Alas, alas! We little knew what we were doing, and yet, for the very life of me, I cannot but see that the hand of Providence was in some way or other connected with the anchoring of the Maine in the harbor of Havana. It is true that we might at some time or other have interfered in the island and there put an end to the mediaeval and murderous practices of old Spain, carried on at our front door here in the end of the 19th century. But war in its best state is a serious business, and Spain might have succeeded for a long time in gulling us with fair-faced promises she never meant to fulfill. In the pride of her heart she regarded the poor Cuban patriots as nothing but a gang of rebels who, had they laid down their arms at her request, would have been treated as so many footballs, as deserving less consideration than mere dogs and cats. Thus it appears to me very doubtful whether we would have embarked upon a war with that proud, haughty, and impoverished nation that loves to talk of her former grandeur 400 years ago. But the Spaniards viewed the coming of the Maine to Havana with hatred and disgust. Whispers in high places in the Cuban capital declared that she should be destroyed, and so in fact she was, for on Tuesday night, the 15th of February, 1898, the Spaniards blew her up with torpedoes planted underneath her in the water. This destruction of a splendid American battleship, with the accompanying loss of 266 lives, brought much comfort and joy to the cruel Spanish heart, for the head gentlemen of Spain at Havana were known to laugh and be jolly, and to drink champagne wine over the destruction of our devoted vessel. But with us it was otherwise. We were overwhelmed with the most profound sorrow and grief. Every man, woman, and child in all Uncle Sam's far-spreading Union was bowed down under this sudden blow that supplied so much comfort to the heart of the Spaniard. He looked upon us as his enemy because of our own sympathy for the Cubans, and so that ship was another enemy out of his way. His mirth did not prevent our national grief over the sudden murder of our 266 men and the loss of the poor ship, so we sat down and cried real, sincere tears, while the Naval Commission were in session at Key West over the cause of the destruction of the unfortunate vessel. The finding of the court of inquiry was that the vessel was not blown up from within, as the Spaniards pretended, but was blown up from without, and that by the hands of the Spaniards, and done on purpose by them. Then we wiped our tears away, and every man, woman, and understanding child from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and from the lakes to the Gulf, arose and took an oath that that cruel and bloody nation of Spaniards should leave this hemisphere, bag and baggage, and that we should make them. Then the shout, "Remember the Maine," was heard all over the land. Congress demanded Spain's withdrawal from American waters, or else that war should be levied on her forthwith. Now did the regent mother country send letters to all the magnates of Europe, begging them to intercede and make peace between the Americans and Spaniards. But from all quarters came the same reply: "You and the Americans help yourselves. This is not our war. Hold the ever faithful isle if you are able." While the war clouds were gathering, the Spaniards still ran around Europe, praying and screeching for help. Uncle Sam went swiftly to work, laid down $50 million instantly, and quickly bought up a number of newly built and powerful men of war from foreign nations, bought and hired swift and powerful merchant vessels, and swiftly clad them round their sides and all over their decks with steel mail, so that they might boldly plough the waves and do as useful service as the very best of ironclads of effete old Spain. Uncle Sam made 2 swift calls for troops, and almost every white and colored man replied, "We come, we come." So terrible indeed was the impression produced by the loss of our poor ship and the murder of 266 men at Havana, that almost every colored and white man in this nation seemed even to sigh and thirst to go and fight with Spain. Women by thousands and tens of thousands offered themselves as nurses, and to be used in any way that the government pleased. Our colored men, once slaves or the children of slaves, but now loyal freemen, came forward almost to a man, and with quite as much patriotism as their white brethren, at least offered themselves as ready, quite ready to march to the war. Uncle Sam's great difficulty lay in his having too many offers on his hands, so he picked and chose and did his best. The fleet, of course, encountered a little more difficulty in filling up, but the flower of our youth, even the sons of millionaires, among the rest, came trooping on in thousands, and our fleet was manned splendidly. Men were sent south by thousands and tens of thousands. The trains carried them down every day, accompanied with immense loads of ammunition and all the appliances of war. Our new and old war vessels were gathered about Key West, etc., and others were placed near our great harbors, which harbors defended by torpedoes and other means of offense and defense. By this time our demand upon Spain to get out of the West Indies had been received by the proud Dons, and had been refused by them as we expected. So we moved on with the war, and our own 4 regiments of regular colored United States troops, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and the 24th and 25th Infantry, which had been brought from the far west to Chickamauga Park, were brought down to Key West in order to be at hand to sail over to Cuba along with their white brothers, when the ever faithful isle, fair Cuba, the queen of the Antilles, should be invaded by all the boys in blue. I am not aware that even the most rabid misanthrope in the United States believed in his heart that there was one colored man who was not willing to go to the war, and also able to do yeoman service in knocking down the Spaniards if he were allowed to get at them. It is true that charges were made against some of us, but charges were also made in the same way against the whites. It is true that some of our men made their marching to war conditional on their now having their own colored officers, but that demand was right, and they only asked their own. Our hereditary enemies are not all dead by any means, yet either they are less formidable, or we ourselves are growing more independent. The small pettifogging journalist tried to make the usual capital out of our men holding out for his most undoubted rights, for what would a white regiment indeed think if the law was that none but colored officers should be placed over white men? And yet that was the very thing that certain men, white men in our nation, demanded, namely that none but white officers should be placed in command of colored soldiers. It is very true there were a few colored officers in the ranks and colored chaplains, but like angels' visits they were few and far between. But the Spanish War was on, and colored men had to go or stay. Some demanded officers of their own race, seeing they were competent to fill such positions as the whitest of men. It was only the dregs of slavery in the bottom of the cup that were left. It was only the difference between a dark skin and a light one, don't you know? Well, quite a number of the governors granted the colored regiments their petitions, gave them all the officers of their own race, from colonel down, and it has been proven that they have acted and succeeded as well as white officers could ever have possibly done. Other governors hesitated about granting their just demands, and claimed that white officers ought to be placed over colored men. But as I said before, the war was now under way, and as too much time could not be lost in wrangling in this unseemly manner over a matter, after all, no greater than the color of the skin, our brave fellows in some of the states said they were willing to give way and go and fight the Spaniards under command of white officers. In some states there was no dispute. It is a well-known fact that colored men have often been greatly attached to their white officers, and in like manner these officers have been greatly attached to their own soldiers, and thus they have got along harmoniously together at all times. At the same time, this knotty point has been settled once for all in many a state, and the men, colored men I mean, have been allowed to have the officers of their own choice. No doubt the time will come when all these trumpery distinctions will be done away, the dregs of slavery washed out of the cup. The time will come in the United States when white men will be led by colored officers and colored men will be led by white officers. Life is really too short for such foolishness as squabbling over small trifles like these. One thing I know, the Bible tells us that God has made of one blood all the races that dwell upon earth. The readings in the public papers about the enthusiasm of colored men for the war against the Spaniards was most refreshing. Taken as a whole, white men of every walk in life awarded them the very highest possible praise for their love of drilling, for their great willingness to be drilled, and for the great progress they made in drilling. Some of them indeed seemed to be drilling both in season and out of season, because even after their officers had given them all their needful drilling for the passing day, they would themselves get together and drill themselves for a whole hour, or for an hour and a half at a time. I must not forget a most unusually lively letter I saw from Key West at the time that our 4 regiments of regulars, United States, were lying there in readiness to sail over to Cuba. This letter stated that they were regiments of grand men, tall, powerful, splendid fellows, full of life, humor, and enthusiasm, and that they looked as if they would be able to lick 3 or 4 Spaniards apiece. No doubt our glorious fellows were far more than a match for the Spaniards, who only weighed about 130 pounds apiece, stood 5 feet 6 inches in height, and few of them seem able to shoot straight, while our men stand 6 feet, are powerful, and can hit the mark almost every time. Thus time passed on while the entire colored race all over the land took the deepest interest in the war, calling upon the War Department or sending to the President whenever there was occasion for the same. A conference of the Zion AME Church at the commencement of the war sat in Baltimore, at which time a notice was sent forth throughout the nation that 10 new cadets for some military reason or other were to be brought forward. The conference here stepped forward and did the right thing. They drew up a most respectful and patriotic address upon the subject to the President, and asked that 3 cadets out of those 10 should be men of color. The address was then sealed up and sent to McKinley. At Baltimore, also under the leadership of Dr. Bryant, a regiment of colored men was organized and drilled in good earnest. At first, many of these young volunteers were awkward enough, but we are all awkward in the beginning, so they persevered and in the course of time became quite proficient, and I have no doubt, had the war lasted and they had gone to the front and met the Spaniards in the open field, that they would have whipped them hip and thigh, as other colored troops did later on. The spirit of all our people was most excellent. We were determined to see ourselves righted, and there were none but a few old soreheads that stood in our way. While we are getting ready to give the Dons a proper knockdown on his own ground, it may not be amiss to notice the most unusual display of American flags, the stars and stripes, that was made here all over our beautiful city of Buffalo, where we still reside. At first we thought that the Queen City of the Lakes, as our city is called, was simply ultra-patriotic and wanted to be ahead of all our neighbors, but soon all eyes were opened wide at our grand mistake, for we learned that there was hardly a city, town, village, or hamlet in the Union where the selfsame grand array of star-spangled banners did not obtain. It was flags, flags, flags from one end of the nation to the other, nothing but flags. I think I'm safe in saying that in any moderate-sized city of the Union there were 10,000 flags flying at least, and these national emblems of faith, loyalty, and love were all sizes from the smallest to the largest, and not alone upon the broad street did the banners fly, but in all the smaller streets and alleys, away up the narrow and crooked alleys, where the poor families of both races were found. These selfsame beautiful banners fluttered to the breeze, and plainly said, "We are here in defense of our native country. No more oppressive dons for us, freedom for Cuba and for all the world. 'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner, oh long may it wave." But the national feeling was exhibited in thousands of other ways besides the flags in the open streets. Great meetings were held all over the land, sermons were preached, and public prayers ascended to the throne of grace for the speedy triumph of our armies over the oppressive Spaniards. The very envelopes that went through the post office were stamped with miniature flags, and pictures of the Maine were hung up in almost every house. No doubt many an ingenious man cleared a good round sum by a newly brought out device that was cast upon the public and eagerly bought up by almost everybody. An immense quantity of patriotic poetry was also written and scattered broadcast to all the 4 winds of heaven, and it was read and quoted with most unbounded enthusiasm. Music came in now for its full share. All the patriotic songs we had were sung and played in public and private to their own well-known tunes. The Star-Spangled Banner indeed took the cake and seemed to be everywhere floating in the air. Even John Bull, our true and faithful friend across the seas, fell into line with us, and he placed the Star-Spangled Banner from one end of the British Isles to the other. Mother England, indeed, was most loyal to us, even before we struck a blow at the Spaniards, for she set down her foot against privateering on the high seas, and Spain submitted to her against her own will. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The brave exploits of our colored regiments around Santiago de Cuba, their rescue of the Rough Riders, with the wounded in the hospitals, regiments that never went to war, great flag presentations at New Orleans, the colored chaplains, the killed, wounded, and sick of the war, coming home and disbanding, etc., the glorious results of the war. Colored men did their duty. Glory to God in the highest. The reader will naturally expect an account of marching and counter-marching, pitched battles, skirmishing, and all kinds of military operations, such as I have already described in the War of 1861–65, and the reader is justified in such expectations. But this American-Spanish War was one of the very shortest conflicts ever recorded in history, for the whole affair was over in less than 4 months, having begun towards the end of April and concluded on the 12th of August, 1898. The readers of my own people will now ask if there was no opportunity given us whereby we might show our prowess upon the battlefield like our Anglo-Saxon brothers. Well, yes, we had opportunities given us to show of what kind of material we were made, and I believe that all the generals, officers, and soldiers in the army awarded us the most unstinted praise for what we did, and they did it with a most hearty goodwill. The heaviest fighting by land was done around the city of Santiago de Cuba, the second city of the island, and the old Spanish capital of the same. Santiago, which means St. James in Spanish, was very strongly fortified and pretty well defended by the ancient and modern methods of an old nation going down in the world. On account of the great danger of assaulting a city built upon hills and thus strongly defended by nature and art, Uncle Sam wisely decided to send his veteran troops there, not merely the pick and cream of the volunteers, but first of all the old, well-seasoned regulars of the American Standing Army, of which there were 4 regiments of colored men, that is to say, the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. Among the first that went to Santiago in General Shafter's expedition were those 4 regiments, brave, powerful, well-built fellows, big, brawny men who could knock Spaniards over like 9 pins and smite them hip and thigh like the heroes of old. In the different engagements that took place while the enemy was being driven into his beleaguered city and was being pushed back, farther and farther into the fortifications of Santiago, these colored regiments did splendid service, laying on with might and main, and making their enemy flee before them into his last retreat. Our troops were usually mixed up with the whites in the days in the end of June and the beginning of July, and thus the history of the one is the history of the other. Seeing, therefore, that they had been so well trained as regulars, we need not wonder that they acquitted themselves so well in the preliminary assault that occurred before preparations were made for the final advance on the doomed city. That part of the operations of our men that caused most noise to be made in the newspapers and elsewhere took place when Colonel Roosevelt and his Rough Riders advanced up one of the hills that was overgrown with dense brushwood, where the Spaniards had dug trenches along the face of the hill, and had run powerful wire fences along the front of those trenches, from which they fired upon the Americans as they came up the hillside. The Rough Riders had a hard time of it as they advanced in the face of the showers of balls that were poured down upon them. Little progress did they make, although they laid down again and again to let those leaden showers pass over their devoted heads. Colonel Roosevelt had a horse killed under him, jumped off the animal before it carried him under as it fell, and advanced up the hill in advance of all his men, shouting to them to come on. Well, of course, the men did come on, but some were killed here, and others were wounded there. Well, as for the Spaniards, they went down like grass before the scythe. As a general thing, they were bad shots, as might be expected of a dying nation, still bragging of the deeds of their ancestors 400 years back, and they themselves swollen with ignorance and pride, too haughty to be taught better ways. Thus the Rough Riders gravely struggled up the hillside, cutting the wire fences as they went, clearing the retreating Spaniards out of the rifle pits, or trenches rather, lying down and advancing again and again as best they could. It was evident that they must suffer great losses, or might even fail altogether. At this very crisis, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, or United States colored troops, were ordered forward to the rescue of their dismounted brothers, and so dismounted, they advanced up the hillside, laughing and hurrahing, with as much strained ease, as cheerfully as if they had been upon their old parade grounds in the far west. Success against the enemy was now assured. Our brave, well-seasoned veterans from the west fired, advanced, laid down, chatted, and laughed with their white brothers as they lay upon the ground, partly hidden among the brushwood, tall grasses, and bushes of the Cuban jungle. And thus the day there was saved, and the white men were saved by the 9th and 10th Cavalry, just in the selfsame way as white and black had often saved one another during the Civil War in the 60s. The wire fences were cut, the trenches were cleared of their occupants, the hilltop was gained, the Spaniards were set upon the run down the hill on the other side, and now our men could see their enemies and have a straight shot at them as they ran down the open in full retreat and rapid flight. Our own trained heroes followed fast after them, dropping on one knee every now and then to get a steadier aim at the fleeing Spaniards, and thus they fell at a rapid rate before our guns. Well, it is true that there was no desire among our own men to be vain of their achievements when they had thus timely assisted in saving and winning the field. Still, the wild and hearty cheers that were there and then given to the black soldiers by their white comrades were very encouraging indeed to the hearts of the former. Many of the letters sent home and published in the papers were quite unstinted in their praise, and showed how the white men shouted their loudest huzzas to the colored men, swung their arms and caps in the air, and made other demonstrations of mutual good will and delight. Most of the Republican papers, and even some of the Democratic and others, wrote editorials and other shorter and well appointed paragraphs too numerous for me either to mention or extract, with the exception of the soreheads and those whose stubborn natures love to hide all such promising things and keep them from public favor. There were none who failed to do us that justice to which we were entitled. As for the 24th and the 25th Colored Infantry, they lent a hand in the different actions that were fought around Santiago, and are well spoken of by one and all whose duty, love, or pleasure it was to record the details of the fighting that took place in the environments of Santiago de Cuba. But what shall we say of all those many regiments of colored men who were raised in many different states and drilled and put in a state of readiness to march forward to the war and assist in knocking down the tottering powers of old and bigoted Spain? Did those men do nothing for their country after all their drillings and other mighty preparations for the purpose of going to the field? What was the use of camp this or camp that or camp the other place to them? Either for good luck or bad luck, as it turned out, all those camps were of no use at all to them, and it was just the same with the white volunteers and their camps. All indeed were drilled and laid to be called away at any moment. All were in perfect readiness to go, and even very greatly desired to go. But few went, for their services were not required, as the war came to an end on the 12th of August, because old Spain was fast going to the wall, as the Bible says of the wicked, I will laugh at your calamity, and mock when your fear cometh. In fact, most that had been done in the war so far had been done upon the sea. Dewey and Schley had sunk Spain's best warships, which circumstance placed the Spanish peninsula entirely at our mercy. Then she was bankrupt and inferior to the United States in every way. We had lost 264 men in the war, who were killed outright, but how many thousands Spain lost she is probably too proud ever to let us know. She probably lost at least 50 to our 1. A great deal has been written about the hospitals in and around Santiago and the conduct and sufferings of the patients who were treated there. It has been universally stated of the colored men who were treated for wounds that they were most exemplary and patient in every way, and even ready and willing to give way in favor of those white soldiers who lay side by side with them, waiting to be treated by the doctors on hand. It is really touching to read in the public papers how our men insisted on their unfortunate suffering neighbors being treated first, and even that they themselves would wait. He is worse than I am. I can wait, and he is shot through the body while I am only wounded in the arms. Save him first. This is the very essence of all generosity. This indeed is the most tender-hearted mercy and Christianity. If there is any bravery and nobility of character upon earth, this indeed is it. And the white Americans in the hospital were quite as generous as the colored men, to both their colored and white companions, according to the direct testimony and eyewitness of foreign and domestic correspondents right there and then on the ground. There was no color line even dreamed of in the fields and hospitals of Santiago. It is only in the day of health and pride that people can afford to draw that line. But in the day of distress, and when death is hovering over us, then all that kind of foolishness is driven far away, and we only know that God has made of one blood all the nations upon the earth. It is quite refreshing to look back even now and think upon the grand times we had, when flags were raised on our houses or flags were presented to regiments of volunteers getting ready to go to fight the Spaniards. I here select from the Southwestern Christian Advocate of New Orleans, an organ of the M.E. Church, the following vivid description of the presentation of a flag of 2 colored troops at New Orleans. A glorious day and a great crowd. On Wednesday of last week, July 20th, there took place in this city the most patriotic demonstration that it has ever been my privilege to witness. It was the occasion of the formal presentation of the regimental flag, the national colors, and a Red Cross flag to the 9th Infantry Regiment of United States Volunteers by the Afro-American citizens of New Orleans. Fully 10,000 people took part in what has been said to be the most enthusiastic gathering around the nation's flag that has ever assembled in the Crescent City for years, if ever before. Political parties and denominational antagonisms were lost sight of in the fixed purpose to do honor to our boys in blue. It was thrilling, inspiring to see 1,000 black soldiers standing in line before the grandstand with eyes to the front and ears attentive to the words of the speakers. The Committee on Program had done their work well in selecting such an array of talent for the occasion. The Honorable J. Madison Vance was master of ceremonies. The grace and dignity with which he conducted the exercises were worthy of the occasion. Reverend W.R. Butler, pastor of the First Street of M.E. Church, led in a fervent and earnest prayer for the protection of our boys and the success of our army. Reverend Dr. Scott, the editor of the Southwestern Christian Advocate, was the orator of the day. His speech was scholarly, burning with eloquence, and full of patriotism and words of advice for the black boys in blue. Again and again he was interrupted by the wildest applause by the vast concourse of people. I'm sorry that space forbids the giving of the whole address. I simply give this. He said, we shall always look to you as our regiment, our boys. We are glad to see you here, glad to have you respond so readily to your country's call, glad you had the opportunity to do so. We present this flag hoping it will ever signify to you the interest we feel in you and impress you with your responsibility to your country and your race. We are a part of a great nation, and there are many reasons why we should be patriotic and true. The strength of a nation is largely measured by its patriotism. If the citizens of a country are devoted to the highest and best interests of that country, there is little cause to fear. Patriotism enlists armies and develops martyrs. The flag was presented by Dr. L. H. Reynolds, editor of the African Methodist, published in this city. Dr. Reynolds is gifted as a speaker, and the thrilling occasion warmed his heart. His words, patriotic and weighty, stirred the entire assembly, which cheered him to the echo. At the conclusion of the address, Mr. Vance introduced Major Armand Roman as a remarkable son from one of the best homes of the South, who received the beautiful and costly flag with well-chosen words. As the flag was unfolded, the cheering was deafening. The officers and soldiers joined with the people in cheering the colors of the 9th Regiment. This flag was purchased by a committee of ladies and gentlemen organized for that purpose. The Red Cross flag was presented by Miss Emma M. Williams, who represented the donor, the Phyllis Wheatley Club, and it was received on behalf of the regiment by Lieutenant Barnett. The national colors were given by the Israel Lodge of the Grand United Order of Oddfellows, and they were presented in a happy speech by the Reverend R. A. Alston of this city. Major Harrison, in his characteristic and earnest way, received the colors for the regiment amid great applause. Colonel Crane, Major Harrison, and the other members of the staff were called forward and given 3 cheers most heartily. The Reverend T. A. Wilson, on behalf of the AME Church, presented the regiment with a number of small Bibles and songbooks. Resolutions pledging loyal support to President Kinley and the country were unanimously adopted. Among others who served on the program were Miss E.V. Edwards, Miss Ida Cohen, Miss Naomi Kitchens, and Mr. A. Lewis. The soldiers seemed happy over the way their friends and loved ones remembered them, and I'm sure they will sustain the confidence of their friends at home, never letting the old flag touch the ground. R.E.J. The above article is taken from the Southwestern Christian Advocate of New Orleans for Thursday, the 28th of July, 1898. There is more of it, but the lines that follow are only taken up with the names of those who were on the different committees. The careful reader must have observed in the article given above what a large share the preachers of the gospel had in the above flag presentations at New Orleans, and right here it may be proper for me to remark that the entire press of this country, so far as they have written on the subject, had given the greatest praise to the colored chaplains of the 4 regular regiments, United States Cavalry and Infantry, and mentioned what a deal their fatherly care and guidance had to do with the building up of the troops. And the same is equally true of those chaplains of those volunteer regiments that got ready for the field but never went to the war because they were not called upon to do so. Although the war with Spain is now over at this writing, September 1898, I know not what may be the ultimate destination of the numerous colored volunteer regiments that were organized for the war, which will be retained for the country's service and which will be disbanded and sent home. There is, however, one regiment from Illinois, all the officers being colored from the colonel down, who have been sent to assist in the garrisoning of Santiago de Cuba. The authorities at Washington have not been slow to reward bravery in the late war with Spain, as the following short article from an exchange will show. Negro bravery rewarded. Washington, D.C., August 1898. 6 colored non-commissioned officers who rendered particularly gallant and meritorious service in the face of the enemy in the actions around Santiago on July 1st and 2nd have been appointed second lieutenants in 2 of the colored immune regiments recently organized under special acts of Congress. These men are Sergeants William Washington of Troop F and John C. Proctor of Troop I of the 9th Cavalry, and Sergeants William McBonejar of Company H, Wyatt Hoffman of Company G, Mason Russell of Company H, and Andrew J. Smith of Company B of the 25th Infantry, commanded by Colonel Daggett. These 2 Negro regiments were in the thick of the fierce fighting at El Caney and San Juan, and won high praise for their courage and efficiency. The 9th Cavalry was also with the Rough Riders at La Casina. As the above extract will show, there has been a disposition shown at Washington to reward bravery, and reward it at once. People have not been wanting to point out who ought to be honored, and honor has been forthcoming on all hands. While I'm engaged writing these pages, the war is practically over, and a great many of the regiments are being disbanded and sent home. It is expected, however, that a larger army will be maintained at the national expense than ever before. We used to support 25,000 men, but now we have the Philippine Islands, Cuba, and Puerto Rico on our hands, besides home duties and the Hawaiian Islands, and therefore we shall need more men than before, at least for some time to come. But all these things must be settled by the authorities at Washington. But it is now my mournful task once more to revert to the 266 men killed on the Main and the 264 killed in that battle. Our list of wounded was much higher, while those who died of fevers contracted in the tropical climates and came home sick were indeed a mournful subject for us to think about. Our men were not used to the heat and rains of the East and West Indies, or even to the lowlands of Florida and other far southern states, which rendered them more helpless than children, so that many died far away from home, while others were too weak to be moved. Some died on the way, and many were carried into our hospitals as soon as they arrived at their destinations. Most of those who could stand the journey were sent on their way home, and all seemed to be glad that the war was over. It is hardly necessary for me to say that this war has largely had the happy result of greatly elevating the character of the United States before the whole world. We are now a second-class naval power, and our praises are sung in all lands from one end of the world to the other. Our armies that fought on shore at Manila and Santiago have been honored by the nations of the earth, Mother England, and all the rest, no matter whether they are willing or not. Immense good will follow to Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and indeed all mankind, for we will teach them what a moral, Christian, and talented people we are. And we have done all this in less than 4 months, at the loss of very few lives indeed, and not at much expense. I feel that Almighty God has been the head and spring of all this, and I am also proud that my own people have done their whole duty, and done it well. Beulah Lincoln, Finney. End of section 22. Section 23 of Historical Romance of the American Negro by Charles Fowler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Blacks in the Revolutionary War and in 1812. I now undertake to write a history of the part which the colored men took in the great American Rebellion. Previous to entering upon that subject, however, I may be pardoned for bringing before the reader the condition of the blacks previous to the breaking out of the war. The Declaration of American Independence, made July 4th, 1776, had scarcely been enunciated, and an organization of the government commenced, ere the people found themselves surrounded by new and trying difficulties, which for a time threatened to wreck the ship of state. The 45 slaves landed on the banks of the James River in the colony of Virginia from the coast of Africa in 1620 had multiplied to several thousands, and were influencing the political, social, and religious institutions of the country. Brought into the colonies against their will, made the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, considered in the light of law and public opinion as mere chattels, things to be bought and sold at the will of the owner, driven to their unrequited toil by unfeeling men picked for the purpose from the lowest and most degraded of the uneducated whites, whose moral, social, and political degradation by slavery was equal to that of the slave. The condition of the Negro was indeed a sad one. The history of this people, full of sorrow, blood, and tears, is full also of instruction for mankind. God has so ordered it that one class shall not degrade another without becoming themselves contaminated. So with slavery in America, the institution bred in the master insulting arrogance, deteriorating sloth, pampered the loathsome lust it inflamed until the licentious luxury sapped the strength and rottened the virtue of the slave owners of the South. Never were the institutions of our people or the principles of liberty put to such a severe test as those of the American Republic. The convention to frame the Constitution for the government of the United States had not organized before the slave masters began to press the claims of their system upon the delegates. They wanted their property represented in the National Congress and undue guarantees thrown around it. They wanted the African slave trade made lawful and their victims returned if they should attempt to escape. They begged that an article might be inserted in the Constitution, making it the duty of the general government to put down the slaves if they should imitate their masters in striking a blow for freedom. They seemed afraid of the very evil they were clinging too closely to. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all. In all this early difficulty, South Carolina took the lead against humanity, her delegates ever showing themselves the foes of freedom, both in the Federal Convention to frame the Constitution and in the state conventions to ratify the same. It was admitted that the blacks had fought bravely against the British and in favor of the American Republic, for the fact that a black man, Crispus Attucks, was the first to give his life at the commencement of the Revolution, was still fresh in their minds. 18 years previous to the breaking out of the war, Attucks was held as a slave by Mr. William Brown of Framingham, Massachusetts, and from whom he escaped about the time, taking up his residence in Boston. The Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770, may be regarded as the first act of the great drama of the American Revolution. From that moment, said Daniel Webster, we may date the severance of the British Empire. The presence of the British soldiers in King Street excited the patriotic indignation of the people. The whole community was stirred, and sage councilors were deliberating and writing and talking about the public grievance. But it was not for the wise and prudent to be the first to act against the encroachments of arbitrary power. A motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish teagues and outlandish jacktars, as John Adams described them in his plea in defense of the soldiers, could not restrain their emotion or stop to inquire if what they must do was according to the letter of any law. Led by Crispus Attucks, the mulatto slave, and shouting, the way to get rid of these soldiers is to attack the main guard, strike at the root, this is the nest. With more valor than discretion, they rushed to King Street and were fired upon by Captain Preston's company. Crispus Attucks was the first to fall, and Samuel Gray and Jonas Caldwell were killed on the spot. Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr were mortally wounded. The excitement which followed was intense. The bells of the town were rung, an impromptu town meeting was held, and an immense assembly was gathered. 3 days after, on the 8th, a public funeral of the martyrs took place. The shops of Boston were closed, and all the bells of Boston and the neighboring towns were rung. It is said that a greater number of persons assembled on this occasion than were ever before gathered on this continent for a similar purpose. The body of Crispus Attucks, the mulatto slave, had been placed in Faneuil Hall with that of Caldwell, both being strangers in the city. Maverick was buried from his mother's house on Union Street, and Gray from his brother's in Royal Exchange Lane. The four hearses formed a junction in King Street, and there the procession marched in columns 6 deep, with a long file of coaches belonging to the most distinguished citizens, to the middle burying ground, where the 4 victims were deposited in one grave, over which a stone was placed with this inscription: Long as in freedom's cause the wise contend, dear to your country shall your fame extend, while to the world the lettered stone shall tell, where Caldwell, Attucks, Gray, Maverick fell. The anniversary of this event was publicly commemorated in Boston by an ovation and other exercises every year until after our national independence was achieved, when the 4th of July was substituted for the 5th of March as the more proper day for a general celebration. Not only was the event commemorated, but the martyrs who then gave up their lives were remembered and honored. For half a century after the close of the war, the name of Crispus Attucks was honorably mentioned by the most noted men of the country, who were not blinded by foolish prejudice. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, Peter Salem, a Negro, distinguished himself by shooting Major Pitcairn, who in the midst of the battle, having passed the storm of fire without mounting the redoubt, and waving the sword, cried to the rebels to surrender. The fall of Pitcairn ended the battle in favor of liberty. A single passage from Mr. Bancroft's history will give a succinct and clear account of the condition of the army in respect to colored soldiers at the time of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Nor should history forget to record that as in the army of Cambridge, so also in this gallant band, the free Negroes of the colony had their representatives. For the right of free Negroes to bear arms in the public defense was at that day as little disputed in New England as their other rights. They took their place not in a separate corps, but in the ranks with the white man, and their names may be read on the pension rolls of the countries side by side with those of other soldiers of the Revolution. Bancroft's History of the United States, Volume 7, page 421. The capture of Major General Prescott of the British Army on the 9th of July, 1777, was an occasion of great joy throughout the country. Prince, the valiant Negro who seized that officer, ought always to be remembered with honor for his important service. The exploit was much commended at the time, as its results were highly important, and Colonel Barton very properly received from Congress the compliment of a sword for his ingenuity and bravery. It seems, however, that it took more than one head to plan and to execute the undertaking. The following account of the capture is historical. They landed about 5 miles from Newport and 3/4 of a mile from the house, which they approached cautiously, avoiding the main guard, which was at some distance. The colonel went foremost with a stout, active Negro close behind him, and another at a small distance. The rest followed so as to be near but not seen. A single sentinel at the door saw and hailed the colonel. He answered by exclaiming against and inquiring for rebel prisoners, but kept slowly advancing. The sentinel again challenged him and required the countersign. He said he had not the countersign, but amused the sentry by talking about rebel prisoners, and still advancing till he came within reach of the bayonet, which he, presenting the colonel, suddenly struck aside and seized him. He was immediately secured and ordered to be silent on pain of instant death. Meanwhile, the rest of the men surrounding the house, the Negro with his head at the second stroke forced a passage into it, and then into the landlord's apartment. The landlord at first refused to give the necessary intelligence, but on the prospect of present death, he pointed to the general's chamber, which being instantly opened by the Negro's head, the colonel, calling the general by name, told him he was a prisoner. Pennsylvania Evening Post, August 7, 1777, in Frank Moore's Diary of the American Revolution, Volume 1, page 468. There is abundant evidence of the fidelity and bravery of the colored patriots of Rhode Island during the whole war. Before they had been formed into a separate regiment, they had fought valiantly with the white soldiers at Red Bank and elsewhere. Their conduct at the Battle of Rhode Island on the 29th of August, 1778, entitles them to perpetual honor. That battle has been pronounced by military authorities to have been one of the best fought battles of the Revolutionary War. Its success was owing in a great degree to the good fighting of the Negro soldiers. Mr. Arnold, in his History of Rhode Island, thus closes his account of it. A third time the enemy, with desperate courage and increased strength, attempted to assail the redoubt, and would have carried it but for the timely aid of 2 Continental battalions dispatched by Sullivan to support his almost exhausted troops. It was in repelling these furious onsets that the newly raised Black Regiment under Colonel Greene distinguished itself by deeds of desperate valor. Posted behind a thicket in the valley, they 3 times drove back the Hessians, who charged repeatedly down the hill to dislodge them, and so determined were the enemy in these successive charges that the day after the battle, the Hessian colonel, upon whom this duty had devolved, applied to exchange his command and go to New York, because he dared not lead his regiment again to battle, lest his men should shoot him by having caused them so much loss. Arnold's History of Rhode Island, Volume 2, pages 427, 428. 3 years later, these soldiers are thus mentioned by the Marquis de Châtelux. The 5th of January, 1781, I did not set out till 11, although I had 30 miles' journey to Lebanon. At the passage to the ferry, I met with a detachment of the Rhode Island Regiment, the same corps we had with us all the last summer, but they have since been recruited and clothed. The greatest part of them are Negroes or mulattoes. They are strong, robust men, and those I have seen had a very good appearance. When Colonel Greene was surprised and murdered near Point Bridge, New York, on the 14th of May, 1781, his colored soldiers heroically defended him till they were cut to pieces, and the Negro reached him over the dead bodies of his faithful Negroes. That large numbers of Negroes were enrolled in the army and serving faithfully as soldiers during the whole period of the War of the Revolution may be regarded as a well-established historical fact, and it should be borne in mind that the enlistment was not confined by any means to those who had before enjoyed the privileges of free citizens. Very many slaves were offered to and received by the army on the condition that they were to be emancipated either at the time of enlistment or when they had served out the term of their enlistment. The inconsistency of keeping in slavery any person who had taken up arms for the defense of our national liberty had led to the passing of an order forbidding slaves as such to be received as soldiers. The colored men were equally serviceable in the last war with Great Britain, is true, as the following historical document will show. General Jackson's proclamation to the Negroes, Headquarters, 7th Military District, Mobile, September 21, 1814, to the free colored inhabitants of Louisiana. Through a mistaken policy, you have heretofore been deprived of a participation in the glorious struggle for national rights in which our country is engaged. This no longer shall exist. As sons of free men, you are now called upon to defend our most inestimable blessing. As Americans, your country looks with confidence to her adopted children for a valorous support, as a faithful return for the advantages enjoyed under her mild and equitable government. As fathers, husbands, and brothers, you are summoned to rally around the standard of the eagle to defend all which is dear in existence. Your country, although calling for your exertions, does not wish you to engage in her cause without amply remunerating you for the services rendered. Your intelligent minds are not to be led away by false representations. Your love of honor would cause you to despise the man who should attempt to deceive you. In the sincerity of a soldier and the language of truth, I address you. To every noble-hearted, generous freeman of color, volunteering to serve during the present contest with Great Britain, and no longer there will be paid the same bounty in money and lands now received by the white soldiers of the United States, viz., $120 in money and 160 acres of land. The non-commissioned officers and privates will also be entitled to the same monthly pay and daily rations and clothes furnished to any American soldier. On enrolling yourselves in companies, the Major General commanding will select officers for your government from your white fellow citizens. Your non-commissioned officers will be appointed from among yourselves. Due regard will be paid to the feelings of freemen and soldiers. You will not, by being associated with white men in the same corps, be exposed to improper comparisons or unjust sarcasm. As a distinct independent battalion or regiment pursuing the path of glory, you will, undivided, receive the applause and gratitude of your countrymen. To assure you of the sincerity of my intentions and my anxiety to engage your invaluable services to our country, I have communicated my wishes to the governor of Louisiana, who is fully informed as to the manner of enrollment and will give you every necessary information on the subject of this address. Andrew Jackson, Major General Commanding. 3 months later, General Jackson addressed the same troops as follows. To the men of color, soldiers, from the shores of Mobile, I collected you to arms. I invited you to share in the perils and to divide the glory of your white countrymen. I expected much from you, for I was not uninformed of those qualities which must render you so formidable to an invading foe. I knew that you could endure hunger and thirst and all the hardships of war. I knew that you loved the land of your nativity, and that, like ourselves, you had to defend all that is most dear to man. But you surpassed my hopes. I found in you, united to these qualities, that noble enthusiasm which impels to great deeds. Soldiers, the President of the United States shall be informed of your conduct on the present occasion, and the voice of the representatives of the American nation shall applaud your valor as your general now praises your ardor. The enemy is near. His sails cover the lakes, but the brave are united, and if he finds us contending with ourselves, it will be for the prize of valor and fame, its noblest reward. Black men served in the Navy with great credit to themselves, receiving the commendation of Commodore Perry and other brave officers. Extract of a letter from Nathaniel Shaler, commander of the private armed schooner General Tompkins, to his agent in New York, dated at sea, January 1st, 1813. Before I could get our light sails in, and almost before I could turn round, I was under the guns, not of a transport, but of a large frigate, and not more than a quarter of a mile from her. Her first broadside killed 2 men and wounded 6 others. My officers conducted themselves in a way that would have done honor to a more permanent service. The name of one of my poor fellows who was killed ought to be registered in the book of fame and remembered with reverence as long as bravery is considered a virtue. He was a black man by the name of John Johnson. A 24-pound shot struck him on the hip and took away all the lower part of his body. In this state the poor brave fellow lay on the deck and several times exclaimed to his shipmates, "Fire away, my boy, no haul a color down." The other was also a black man by the name of John Davis, and was struck in much the same way. He fell near me, and several times requested to be thrown overboard, saying he was only in the way of others. When America has such tars, she has little to fear from the tyrants of the ocean. End of section 23. Section 24 of Historical Romance of the American Negro by Charles Fowler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nick Biddle. The title of First Defenders has been given to the 5 companies of Pennsylvania troops, 2 of which were from Schuylkill County, 1 from Reading, 1 from Allentown, and 1 from Lewistown, Pennsylvania, that marched through Baltimore on the day before the Massachusetts soldiers were mobbed in the streets on the way to defend the national capital. After running the gauntlet of a furious rabble, the 5 companies reached Washington on the evening of the 18th and were quartered in the Capitol building. A pool of blood which ran from the wounded neck of Nick Biddle marked the spot on the Capitol floor where he lay that night. It was the first blood shed in the war for the Union. His grave is in the colored churchyard in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. The grave of Nick Biddle a Mecca should be to pilgrims who seek in this land of the free, the tombs of the lowly as well as the great, who struggled for freedom in war or debate. For there lies a black man distinguished from all, in that his veins furnished the first blood to fall in war for the Union, when traitors assailed its brave first defenders whose hearts never quailed. The 18th of April, 1861, was the day Nick Biddle his great laurels won. In Baltimore City, where riot ran high, he stood by our banner to do or to die, and onward responsive to liberty's call, the capital city to reach ere it fall. Brave Biddle, with others as true and as brave, marched through the wild tempest the nation to save. Their pathway was fearful, surrounded by foes, who strove in fierce madness their course to oppose, who hurl threats and curses defiant of law, and think by such methods they may overawe the gallant defenders, who nevertheless hold back their resentment as forward they press, and, conscious of noble endeavor, despise the flashing of weapons and traitorous eyes. Behold now the crisis, the mob thirsts for blood, it strikes down Nick Biddle and opens the flood. The torrents of crimson from hearts that are true, that shall deepen and widen, shall clean and renew the land of our fathers by slavery cursed. The blood of Nick Biddle, yes, it is the first, the patter of raindrops presaging the storm that will rage and destroy till the nation reform. How strange, too, it seems that the Capitol floor, where slaveholders sat in the Congress of yore, and forged for his kindred chains heavy to bear, to bind down the black man in endless despair, should be stained with his blood, and thus sanctified, made sacred to freedom through time to abide, a temple of justice with every right for all of the nation, black, red men, and white. The grave of Nick Biddle, though humble it be, is nobler by far in the sight of the free than tombs of those chieftains whose sinful crusade brought long years of mourning and countless graves made, in striving to fetter their black fellow men and make of the Southland a vast prison pen. Their cause was unholy, but Nick Biddle was just, and hosts of pure spirits watch over his dust. End of section 24. Section 25 of Historical Romance of the American Negro by Charles Fowler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Theodore Roosevelt, and color is no bar to office. Deeds are indestructible, ideas are imperishable, and mind is immortal. Children, says George Eliot, may be strangled, deeds never. They have an indestructible life, both in mind and outside of our consciousness. It is not to be wondered at, therefore, that many of the ancients of the distant past should have predicated eternal life upon deeds and ideas, deeds which are formidable, and ideas which grow and expand and gather strength until they become the very life of the social, moral, and religious structure of the nation. To my mind, there can be no truer measurement of a man, or a race, or a nation than the standard of ideas which formulate themselves into deeds. Deeds and ideas which, according to Disraeli, render a man independent of his constituencies, independent of dissolution, independent even of the course of time. Measure from this standard Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States of America, is the most unique figure before the American people today. No president since the days of Lincoln, the emancipator, merits in a larger degree the unselfish praise and devotion not only of his countrymen, but of the whole civilized world. In the strictest sense of the term, he is a man of destiny, born, like all true leaders and reformers, at a particular time, for a particular purpose, endowed by nature with a constitution which defies the encroachment of disease, with an intellect which craves the most rigid discipline, with a courage which knows no daring, and a conscience which repels the slightest innovation which might result to the detriment of his fellow man, regardless of race, color, or creed. It was for Abraham Lincoln to issue the Proclamation of Freedom and thus save the nation from disintegration. It is for Theodore Roosevelt to preserve that proclamation and preserve the amendments to the Constitution, which is the very life of the freedom guaranteed to the emancipated. From the time of President Grant down to the present time, there has been a persistent attempt on the part of the South to paralyze the spirit and practice of the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, without which freed men would have no legal standing in the nation. The amendments received a dangerous wound during the administration of President Hayes. From the effects of this wound it hardly ever recovered. When, by a strange providence, Theodore Roosevelt was called suddenly to occupy the place of the martyred President McKinley, a most lovable and peaceful man, black men and their friends all over the country rejoiced in the hope of a better day, when right and justice would succeed policy and conciliation. In this we were not mistaken. Not that Theodore Roosevelt loves the black man any more than any of his predecessors, but that Theodore Roosevelt has convictions, and the courage of his convictions, regardless of consequences. The appended correspondence, which explains itself, will render him immortal, and will keep his memory fresh in the recollection of his fellow men. And when future historians chronicle his acts, they shall speak of him as Theodore the Great and the Good. Color is no bar to office. President Roosevelt defines his attitude in a letter to a South Carolinian, who includes in a number of objections to the appointment of Dr. Crum as collector of the port of Charleston the statement that he is a Negro. The President declares that he will continue to appoint colored men of intelligence and standing. incentive to good citizenship. Washington, November 27. The President has sent the following communication to a prominent citizen of Charleston, South Carolina. Personal, White House, Washington, November 26, 1902. My dear Sir, I am in receipt of your letter of November 10th and one from Mr. Blank under date of November 11th in reference to the appointment of Dr. Crum as collector of the port of Charleston. In your letter you make certain specific charges against Dr. Crum, tending to show his unfitness in several respects for the office sought. These charges are entitled to the utmost consideration from me, and I shall go over them carefully before taking any action. After making these charges, you add as a further reason for opposition to him that he is a colored man, and after reciting the misdeeds that followed carpetbag rule and Negro domination in South Carolina, you say that we have sworn never again to submit to the rule of the African, and such an appointment as that of Dr. Crum to any such office forces us to protest unanimously against this insult to the white blood. And you add that you understood me to say that I would never force a Negro on such a community as yours. Mr. Blank puts the objection of color first, saying, first, he is a colored man, and that of itself ought to bar him from the office. In view of these last statements, I think I ought to make clear to you why I am concerned and pained by your making them, and what my attitude is as regards all such appointments. How anyone could have gained the idea that I had said I would not appoint reputable and upright colored men to office, when objection was made to them solely on account of their color, I confess I'm wholly unable to understand. At the time of my visit to Charleston last spring, I had made, and since that time I have made, a number of such appointments from several states in which there was considerable colored population. For example, I made one such appointment in Mississippi, and another in Alabama, shortly before my visit to Charleston. I had at that time appointed 2 colored men as judicial magistrates in the District of Columbia. I've recently announced another such appointment for New Orleans, and have just made one from Pennsylvania. The great majority of my appointments in every state have been of white men. North and South alike, it has been my sedulous endeavor to appoint only men of high character and good capacity, whether white or black. But it has been my consistent policy, in every state where their numbers warranted it, to recognize colored men of good repute and standing in making appointments to office. These appointments of colored men have in no state made more than a small proportion of the total number of appointments. I'm unable to see how I can legitimately be asked to make an exception for South Carolina. In South Carolina, to the 4 most important positions in the state, I've appointed 3 men and continued in office a 4th, all of them white men. 3 originally gold Democrats, 2 of them, as I am informed, the sons of Confederate soldiers. I've been informed by the citizens of Charleston whom I met that these 4 men represent a high grade of public service. I do not intend to appoint any unfit man to office. So far as I legitimately can, I shall always endeavor to pay regard to the wishes and feelings of the people of each locality. But I cannot consent to take the position that the door of hope, the door of opportunity, is to be shut upon any man, no matter how worthy, purely upon the grounds of race or color. Such an attitude would, according to my convictions, be fundamentally wrong. If, as you hold, the great bulk of the colored people are not yet fit in point of character and influence to hold such positions, it seems to me that it is worth while putting a premium upon the effort among them to achieve the character and standing which will fit them. The question of Negro domination does not enter into the matter at all. It might as well be asserted that when I was governor of New York, I sought to bring about Negro domination in that state because I appointed 2 colored men of good character and standing to responsible positions, one of them to a position paying a salary twice as large as that paid in the office now under consideration, one of them as a director of the Buffalo Exposition. The question raised by you and Mr. Blank in the statements to which I refer is simply whether it is to be declared that under no circumstances shall any man of color, no matter how upright and honest, no matter how good a citizen, no matter how fair in his dealings with all his fellows, be permitted to hold any office under our government. I certainly cannot assume such an attitude, and you must permit me to say that in my view it is an attitude no man should assume, whether he looks at it from the standpoint of the true interest of the white man of the South or of the colored man of the South, not to speak of any other section of the Union. It seems to me that it is a good thing from every standpoint to let the colored man know that if he shows in marked degree the qualities of good citizenship, that the qualities which in a white man we feel are entitled to reward, then he will not be cut off from all hope of similar reward. Without any regard as to what my decision may be on the merits of this particular applicant for this particular place, I feel that I ought to let you know clearly my attitude on the far broader question raised by you and Mr. Blank, an attitude from which I have not varied during my term of office. Faithfully yours, Honorable Theodore Roosevelt, Charleston, South Carolina. End of section 25. End of Historical Romance of the American Negro by Charles Fowler.